Chapter 334. Everyone was still silent, but some of the officers' faces were slightly red, and a hint of struggle flashed through their eyes. They felt a strong sense of humiliation and anger, but no one dared to say anything. This was because they were in the military camp, and the person who had said those words was a major general, and the person who was rudely reprimanding them was Du Shaoqing. The lines of this young military general's face were very clear, just like the tactics he used to command the Iron 7th Division. Through the lenses of his sunglasses, one could faintly see his extremely deep eye sockets, just like the strict military discipline of the troops he led, deep and inviolable. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division were proud and indifferent, and as a division commander, Du Shaoqing brought this temperament to the extreme. Coupled with his well-ironed general's uniform, his appearance and posture left a deep impression in people's minds. He had an exceptionally iron-blooded charm. No one in the federal military dared to deny this charm. In formal situations, no one had ever seen Du Shaoqing smile. Only the coldest and most ruthless people, who treated others and themselves to the extreme, could single-handedly train a troop like the Iron 7th Division. But many people knew that in private, Division Commander Du's favorite thing to do was to play the violin on the balcony of the barracks. The military camp was a place where the hierarchy was particularly strict. As a division commander, Du Shaoqing, no matter what he said or did, these officers who were much lower in rank than him could only listen obediently. Even if they were not convinced, they could only blush and straighten their backs even more. No one dared to voice out their doubts. The Federation government now particularly appreciated the Iron 7th Division, and the military also relied heavily on Du Shaoqing. After today's military exercise, he was the one who gave the speech, which already showed a certain inclination. Today, when war was about to begin, a sharp and cold military knife like Du Shaoqing could not be hidden in its scabbard forever. Even if the fierce man from the Zhong family in the Westwoods tried to suppress him, he would not be able to hold down the handle of the knife. The strict discipline and silence displayed by the trainees at this time could not melt the ice on Du Shaoqing's face. His sharp eyes slowly scanned the surroundings through the lenses of his sunglasses, and coldly said, "For a preset military exercise like this, regardless of the outcome, it has no meaning to the Federation soldiers." With one sentence, he had made the graduation speech organized by the Federal Military of Japanese Army a piece of shit. Probably only this major general, who had thousands of eyes on him, dared to say such words. However, his words also erased the most awe-inspiring capital of the Iron 7th Division in one stroke. When others heard it, they could not refute it at all. Du Shaoqing quietly looked at the officers in front of him. Only he knew that these words were from his heart. The stage of a soldier could only be the real battlefield. Even if the Iron 7th Division led by him could always maintain the victory of the military exercise in the next 100 years, what was the point? If he could not set foot in the Westwoods, defeat the imperial armies, and make a real contribution, his title as a famous general was only a famous general on paper. He could not even beat the fierce tiger from the Westwoods whose surname was Zhong, let alone catch up with the old man from Lake Feiqing. Thinking of this, Du Shaoqing's expression became even colder. The lines on his jawline were abnormally stiff. He coldly reprimanded, "The Federation has only successfully assembled 27 MXs. This time we transferred 8 MXs to you. You actually fought like this. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel ashamed?" Du Shaoqing did not seem to be satisfied. He coldly looked at the crowd and calmly said, "After fighting with the 7th Division and seizing 2 tactical targets, do you feel very satisfied? Before the battle, you are already thinking about losing. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel ashamed? Even these 2 targets were given to you by my subordinates." Du Shaoqing reprimanded in a deep voice, "I don't want to give you any face. I also don't care about the military exercise command center's plan. The sand table is the battlefield. Today the 7th Division didn't let you lose too badly. It has nothing to do with you. I was just thinking about those normal soldiers who were carelessly commanded by you. As a military officer, I don't want to see the soldiers at the bottom lose all hope in the future command system of the Federation military. Fighting a fake battle, yet you still need the opponent to deliberately show mercy. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel that you are trash? Ashamed, ashamed, trash. Each sentence was sharper and heavier than the last, especially what Du Xiaoqing said at the end. Today, the joint column under the command of the military officer had taken 2 tactical targets, and it was actually the Iron 7th Division that deliberately let them win. The military officer cadets clearly knew that at the beginning of the military exercise, they found a lot of objective difficulties for themselves. They did not have the courage to try and defeat the Iron 7th Division. After being pointed out by Commander Du, they no longer felt as proud as before. Instead, they felt a little ashamed. But when they heard the last sentence, they felt very indignant. This was the result of the battle that they fought for. How did it become the Iron 7th Division letting them win? The military officers stood even straighter. It was as if there was fire in their eyes. But under the strict military discipline, still no one dared to stand out. You know how to be angry, it means that you still have a sense of shame. You are not considered trash that can't be saved. Although you are not far from being useless. Du Xiaoqing looked at everyone coldly. His hands that were holding the black leather gloves were behind his back. He said lightly, "Zhou Yu, step forward." Zhou Yu was slightly shocked. He took a step forward from the formation and stood at attention. He looked straight ahead and saluted. His movement was extremely clean and neat. He was a gentle gentleman. Facing this cold and dignified Major General, he could not help but be extra cautious. He wanted to make sure that the other side would not be able to find any mistakes in the details. The second tactical deduction from the anti-terrorism drill? Du Xiaoqing had not walked past him before, so he casually glanced at him. "Yes, General." Zhou Yu answered loudly with an expressionless face. "The second tactical deduction," Du Xiaoqing said indifferently, "let me ask you, if the 7th Division gave up on the backup and didn't provide any support when your mecha battalion went straight to the bottom of Silent Hill and attacked your camp with the armored brigade, what would you do?" The atmosphere in the middle of the silent field suddenly changed. This was because all the military officers, including the instructor standing outside, could hear that this division commander Du Xiaoqing, who was known for his tactical deduction, was actually going to verbally test the military officers' brains today. He wanted to use this to prove to everyone that the 7th Division had gone easy on them today. This was to give these military officers a heavy blow to their confidence. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, was not afraid at all. His eyes suddenly lit up and he replied in a clear voice. "The instructor said that the MX mecha is best at surprise attacks and decapitation. Our army will need 34 minutes to rush down to provide assistance, and 12 minutes to return to the camp. Within 46 minutes, the 70th Division's armored brigade will not be able to pass through Area 452. 124. Why not?" Du Xiaoqing looked at him coldly. "Because the road is not easy to travel, General." It was rare for Zhou Yu to be so playful. It seemed that even someone as gentle and polite as him felt a bit of disgust towards the aggressive Du Xiaoqing. When he heard Zhou Yu mention the instructor, Su Lu was smiling with his head lowered. Hearing this, his smile widened. Du Xiaoqing was not affected. He was not angry, but he did not laugh. He asked coldly, "Why is it not easy to travel?" Zhou Yu was slightly taken aback. He replied, "The area is all mountainous. The armored brigade is not suitable to advance quickly in this kind of terrain. Also, the 7th Division's commander should have considered that it is easy to be attacked by individual weapons in this kind of terrain. The casualty rate is too high. There is no need to consider casualty rates in war." Du Xiaoqing said coldly. To the side of Area 452. 124. There is a temporary road used by the main assembly base for maintenance of the radar station. Although it has been out of use for 20 years, the armored brigade can still force its way through without any problem. As soon as these words were said, the originally silent scene was instantly filled with gasps. Who would have thought that Du Xiaoqing would actually know of a maintenance road that had been out of use for 20 years? Perhaps even the logistics officer of the base would not be able to describe the location of this road so casually. Zhou Yu's eyes narrowed. He felt a trace of nervousness and disbelief. His brow furrowed, and after a moment of silence he said, "The map provided by the Exercise Command Center did not indicate this road. You officers have been in this base for 8 months. Du Xiaoqing reprimanded in a low voice. The 7th Division only received the order for the exercise 3 days ago. The 7th Division came from System S3. They only used 3 days to find this abandoned road, but you guys don't know about it. Is this an excuse? Zhou Yu frowned and thought for a long time. He confirmed that if the 70th Division's armored brigade had been able to use this road, the situation of today's military exercise would have been greatly reversed. But who would have thought that the people of the Iron 7th Division would actually know the terrain of the military exercise area better than they did? Preparation for the battlefield was indeed the most important thing. Could it be that the other side had really gone easy on them today, and that was why the troops under his command were able to get a barely passable result? Thinking of this, Zhou Yu's brow furrowed even tighter. He said very seriously, even if the armored brigade was able to use this road that we don't know about, how could they have discovered the location of the Joint Army's camp? I've already set up 3 layers of electronic interference barriers beforehand, and the satellite signal filtering and disguising has also been completed. He raised his head to look at Du Shaoqing's cold profile and said, and the armored brigade's disguise radius is not large. After I discovered them, the MX mecha that had returned to help would have been able to coordinate with the heavy infantry to disperse them before they could reach me. Why couldn't they have discovered your camp? Forget about the things you learned in Number 1 Academy. Du Shaoqing said coldly. Those electronic barriers of yours are as densely packed as an old woman's underwear. I don't know if it's because you're afraid of the cold or because you're afraid of exposing your body, but you actually set up so many layers. There's a very simple principle on the battlefield. It's just like being a person. The thing that you want to protect the most is the most vulnerable and most important part of your enemy. A thick sense of mockery flashed across his face that was not covered by the sunglasses. Any civilian equipment would have been able to discover the strangeness of your area. Even if they didn't know what you were hiding, they would still know that it was your weak point. Cold sweat gradually seeped out of Zhou Yu's back. He suddenly raised his head and retorted, "You're gambling with the armored brigade's life. If I deliberately used 3 layers of electronic barriers as a disguise to lure the armored brigade into the ambush," Du Shaoqing unhappily waved his hand and cut him off. He said coldly, "All of your soldiers are tied up at the eastern line of Silent Hill. How would you have extra soldiers to set up an ambush? Even if the armored brigade didn't find your camp, once they came out from there, they would be able to circle around your camp and coordinate with the main force of the 7th Division. How many people do you think will be able to survive today? The most important thing is." Du Shaoqing looked at Zhou Yu indifferently. He increased his tone and said with a pressuring tone, "Your camp is right there. A soldier must dare to gamble on the battlefield. A soldier who doesn't have the will to gamble is destined to be a failure." Zhou Yu slowly lowered his head. He furrowed his eyebrows and thought for a long time. Then he raised his head firmly and said, "Even if the armored brigade comes, I can still use the 44-man assault formation to retreat. As long as I can hold on until the mecha camp comes back, this battle can still be fought." 120. 447 area. How much power do you have left? One of the 7th Division's divisions is watching over there, Du Shaoqing said coldly without hesitation. Zhou Yu thought for a while and replied, "But 120. For 4-6 area is still in my hands. The highest altitude here is 1,245 meters. Your assault helicopters won't be able to do much damage." Du Shaoqing said expressionlessly, "Your MX is on the way back. Although the 7th Division's M52 is a little slow, it's not like they can't walk on the mountain road." Zhou Yu was stunned. He frowned and thought for a long time. There was no terminal computer, no holographic screen, no map coordinates, no firepower deployment data, and no modern tools. The most talented division commander in the Federation, and the best tactical deduction expert in the new generation of military officers, were just using his memory and understanding of the troops on the battlefield to make verbal deductions. The field grew quieter and quieter. Only the voices of these 2 people could be heard. It was as if there were golden spears and armored horses colliding in the air, making crisp and silent sounds of collisions. There was also the faint smell of smoke from the explosions of gunpowder. However, Division Commander Du Shaoqing's tone was always cold and indifferent. Moreover, he didn't need time to think before making any deployment. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, took longer and longer to think, and his voice became more and more labored. The federal military recognized Du Xiaoqing as the #1 person in terms of strategic intelligence and tactical command. For Zhou Yu to be able to argue verbally with him was already very impressive in the eyes of everyone present. However, looking at the cold-faced division commander wearing sunglasses, everyone felt an incomparable chill in their hearts. They wondered what exactly Du Xiaoqing's brain was made of. The few lieutenant colonels of the Iron 7th Division who came with Du Xiaoqing had calm expressions. They had seen too much of their division commander's shocking military intelligence and had long gotten used to all of this. On the contrary, they instead felt a faint admiration for Zhou Yu, who had been verbally deducing tactics with his division commander until now. Back when he was at the Westwoods Preparatory Military Academy, Zhou Yu was already regarded as a genius, completely overshadowing his already excellent brother Zhou Jin. He was sent by the 4th Military Region to the 1st Military Academy to study history and battle examples. He was incomparably diligent, and that was why he had achieved what he had today. However, what made him feel incomparably oppressed was that the division commander he was facing today, Du Xiaoqing, was actually as cold and unapproachable as a snowy mountain. Every virtual command that came out of this person's thin lips was like a noose that tied people to death, making it difficult for him to breathe, and cold sweat trickled down his back. What made him even more fearful was that Du Xiaoqing's tactical commands were not only sharp and forceful, they were also meticulous in taking care of the details. There was not the slightest gap, and his calculations were extremely precise. It made people feel a sense of defeat, and they actually gradually lost all of their confidence. The joint column will definitely lose. I admit that the Iron 7th Division showed mercy today. After a long silence, Zhou Yu reluctantly admitted defeat and gave a military salute. "Return to your unit," Du Xiaoqing said coldly, but the eyes hidden behind the sunglasses flashed with a hint of surprise. He had not expected that there would actually be a talent in this batch of officers. In just a split second, he had the thought of transferring Zhou Yu to the 7th Division. He glanced coldly at Zhou Yu, who had already returned to his unit, and suddenly remembered that this young officer seemed to be someone from the Tai family. Teacher Du Xiaoqing had always been cold and self-controlled, but he was also a person with great ambition and ambition. A successful general needed countless outstanding subordinates, and without question, Zhou Yu had this potential. He believed that he was a tolerant person, and also believed that the melting pot known as the Iron 7th Division would definitely be able to attract truly outstanding professional soldiers. It was because of this innate calm and self-confidence that even though he had clearly thought of Zhou Yu's background, he was only slightly taken aback, and did not have the slightest hesitation in his desire to take this person into the Iron 7th Division. Tolerant was only tolerant of those who were willing to be accommodated. Towards those who were unwilling to be accommodated, Teacher Du Xiaoqing had always been as cold as winter. His blade-like gaze swept past Su Lu through his sunglasses, and then he quickly retracted it. "If you know that you are trash, then there is still room for improvement." Du Xiaoqing looked at the extremely ugly expressions of the officer students and said coldly. Just as the entire field was deathly silent, preparing for Teacher Du's storm-like reprimand, an extremely untimely voice suddenly rang out. "Spending so much effort to win against a piece of trash who just graduated from school, it's really meaningless." As these words were spoken, the entire field fell silent, and a chilling sense of danger arose spontaneously. The military camp was strictly governed by military hierarchy. When a major general was lecturing, who would allow a subordinate to casually interrupt? Earlier, the officer students had been thoroughly reprimanded, their faces flushed red, but they could only puff out their chests. Now, someone had actually appeared out of nowhere and said such a thing. If this wasn't courting death, then what was? Moreover, these words were clearly directed at Du Xiaoqing and his 7th Division. Previously, Teacher Du had said that the military exercise of the Federation was meaningless, so this person had said that Du Xiaoqing's victory over Zhou Yu was just an armchair strategist. What was even more frightening was the hidden meaning in this person's words. Teacher Du had coldly and harshly condemned this group of officer students as trash. "Then you work so hard to win against a trash. What was that?" These words were not spoken by Su Lu. The military camp was a place filled with the smell of iron and blood. The reprimands of superiors were all loud, and there were many people who scolded even more harshly than Du Xiaoqing. There were all sorts of obscenities. Speaking of which, when Sulu had been an instructor, he had also often scolded people as trash in class, but people were just so strange. Sulu always viewed these officer students as his own students and scolded them himself. Hearing Du Xiaoqing's incomparably cold reprimand, he felt exceptionally uncomfortable in his heart. However, he knew of the problem between himself and the Iron 7th Division, especially after feeling Du Xiaoqing's cold gaze sweep over him twice earlier. Although he wanted to protect his calf, under the difference of military ranks, he could not do so. He could only remain silent. But Major Lan Xiaolong, who stood behind him, could not hold back the hint of dissatisfaction and mockery in his heart. After his slightly mocking voice rang out, the entire field instantly fell into an even more absolute silence than before. The 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division standing on the left side of the formation suddenly turned around and looked in the direction of the voice. These 3 officers had been silent the entire time. Their military posture was perfect. Even after standing for such a long time, their eyebrows didn't even twitch. They looked like 3 ice sculptures that were cold and indifferent, keeping people thousands of miles away. But at this time, these 3 officers were like fierce tigers that had suddenly awakened. 3 pairs of blade-like eyes stared at Lan Xiaolong's face at the same time. Du Xiaoqing's sword-like eyebrows raised slightly. He slowly turned his head and also looked in that direction. There was no way the military camp would allow this kind of insubordination to happen. Lan Xiaolong had been stationed here for a long time in Garrison Unit 8384, and had endured until he became a major. However, he had more or less an undisciplined aura, just like the members of the 7th Combat Group behind Sulu and Sulu. Even when the 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division glared at him with angry eyes, Lan Xiaolong still had an indifferent expression on his face. He even raised his eyebrows. But when Division Commander Du Xiaoqing also turned his head, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He was a little confused. This division commander was clearly wearing sunglasses, but why did he feel like his gloomy gaze was about to pierce into his heart? One of the 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division was the guard officer Du Xiaoqing, Shimin Jin, who had previously made Sulu exclaim at Du Xiaoqing's arrogance. As a lieutenant colonel, he was willing to serve as Du Xiaoqing's guard officer. Naturally, he was incomparably loyal. Shimin Jin strode in front of Lan Xiaolong. His face was so gloomy that it seemed like rain was about to fall. He moved a few centimeters in front of Lan Xiaolong and scolded him loudly. "Which division are you from? Don't you know the rules? Who allowed you to interrupt when your superior is scolding you? Where are the military regulations that you learned? Tell me your name." Lan Xiaolong's ears were about to be deafened. Feeling the spittle on his face, he was a little displeased. However, he was suppressed by the other party's ferocious roar and anger. He looked at the gloomy face in front of him and believed that if Du Xiaoqing wanted to kill him right now, this guard officer would definitely pull out his gun and shoot him without hesitation. In order to maintain military discipline, Commander Du Xiaoqing naturally wouldn't execute Lan Xiaolong for his actions. However, he would definitely make him suffer a lot. He might even be locked up in a dark room for half a month. However, Lan Xiaolong didn't regret this. As a member of the 17 Mechanics Division, how happy was it to be able to mock Du Xiaoqing to his face? Furthermore, although his temperament was undisciplined, he still had the perseverance of the Federation soldiers. He looked at Shimin Jin indifferently and didn't say a word, waiting to be punished later. At this moment there was a slight movement behind him. He was pulled behind someone. He looked over in shock and found that it was Sulu who had protected him in front of him. It was like an old hen protecting her child. "He's Major Lan Xiaolong, a member of the Whitewater Company's 7th Combat Team," Sulu explained to the guard officer in front of him. He had a headache about the trouble Lan Xiaolong had caused. The members of the Iron 7th Division had been looking for a chance to vent their anger on him. If he stepped in, wouldn't he be giving the other party the best reason? However, the members of the 7th Division were all orphans without a mother. With a wave of his hand, the old man in Philadelphia removed them from their official military status and put them under Suli's command. As the supervisor, he had to step in at this moment. "Since you're not a training officer, why are you here now?" Shimin-jin looked at Sulu and continued to scold him loudly. His expression was dark. Sulu replied sincerely, "This is an order from the Ministry of Defense. I don't understand what's going on either." Shimin-jin frowned and said coldly, "He's your subordinate? Who are you?" Base Mecha Instructor Sulu, currently the supervisor of the Whitewater Company's 7th Combat Team. Shimin-jin's expression was dark and he said disdainfully, "As expected, the kind of instructor produces the kind of students. The kind of supervisor produces the kind of cowardly soldiers." Hearing these words, Suli's eyebrows twitched slightly. The two small flying knives seemed to have the thought of flying. Shortly after, he took a light breath and said seriously, "It's not up to you to judge whether my soldiers are cowards or not. I may not be a good supervisor or a good instructor, but I think the students participating in today's military exercise are all not bad." Hearing these words, the expressions of the students standing in a row, who had initially been somewhat ugly, softened slightly. They all thought in their hearts that Instructor Xiao Su was usually a jerk, but in front of outsiders he actually gave them face. However, they did not expect that this thought had already placed them in the same category as Sulu. They had even copied Suli's way of calling himself young master in class. As for the combat personnel of the 7th Combat Team, most of them were from the 17th Mechanic Division. They had an irreconcilable enmity with Du Xiaoqing's Iron 7th Division. Hearing Suli's words made them very happy. Furthermore, they were originally non-military personnel, so they had less to worry about. Xiong Linquan purposely made himself not look at that ice-cold instructor Du Xiaoqing and said faintly, "Our soldiers are indeed quite cowardly. It's just that we often go to the Westwoods to kill the Empire's people." Xiong Linquan's words were undoubtedly a loud slap to the face of the Iron 7th Division's officer. The stern look in Shimin-jin's eyes gradually deepened. He stared at Sulu in front of him and said coldly, "You really have guts. You're a lieutenant colonel, and I'm also a lieutenant colonel. Why should I act pitiful and resentful in front of you?" From the moment the 7th Division appeared in front of him, Sulu instinctively felt a sense of danger. Du Xiaoqing had reprimanded everyone mercilessly, and his anger had already accumulated to a certain extent. At this moment, looking at the gloomy face of the guard in front of him and hearing his words, the two throwing knives on his forehead finally flew up. He replied indifferently. Shimin-jin was slightly stunned. He did not argue with him about the military rank. Instead, he looked at Lan Xiaolong who was behind Sulu and said coldly, "You violated the rules. Have your man come out." In the military camp, this request was not unreasonable. However, Sulu was not a professional soldier, and his personality also determined that he would not hand Lan Xiaolong over today. However, in the face of strict military discipline, what could he do? Earlier, when Teacher Du and Student Zhou you were conducting tactical simulations, this subordinate of mine only wanted to participate in the discussion. He did not intentionally interrupt the senior officer's conversation. I don't think he needs to be disciplined. Sulu narrowed his eyes and actually said such a thing. "You guys are from the 17th Division?" Right at this moment, Du Xiaoqing's cold and oppressive question came from the other end of the line. "I don't know how to fight." Sulu learned from Teacher Du's experience of pretending. Tomorrow he'll show it a little. Chapter 335. Hearing his teacher's words, Lieutenant Colonel Shimin-jin's expression turned solemn. He quickly put away his angry and dark expression and calmly turned away, exposing Suli's body to everyone's eyes. Suli's heart chilled slightly. This guard's change in expression so quickly could only mean that his previous roaring and anger had all been an act. The Iron 7th Division was just looking for a reason to deal with him. Sulu himself was a youth who occasionally got angry, so when faced with Shimin-jin or even Du Xiaoqing's anger, he would not be afraid. However, today's opponent was a general whose rank and authority were far above his, and who had always maintained a calm mind and a cold hostility. This matter was somewhat troublesome. Lieutenant Colonel Su, as an instructor, do you have your own opinion on the tactical deduction for this military exercise? Du Xiaoqing said coldly. His speed was normal and even his tone was normal. Just by pointing out Su Li's rank, he naturally had the air of a military camp. Sulu had thought that this iron-blooded teacher would come to find trouble with him, but he did not expect the other's first words to be like this. Hearing the calmness and self-restraint in Du Shaoqing's words, as well as a natural sense of majesty, he silently thought that some of the truly important people in this world were probably used to their words, and no one dared to refute them. Therefore, there was naturally some kind of unquestionable coldness and valiance in their words. I'm teaching mecha, not deduction. Sulu lowered his head slightly and said calmly, if you want me to do tactical deduction, even if you give me 3 divisions, in front of the Iron 7th Division, they will only end up dead. In a person's life, who knew how many conflicts they had to go through before they could reach their goal. However, the prerequisite for competing with others was that you had to have the ability to compete, except for some issues that involved principles and could not be challenged. The Iron 7th Division was not Macklin, and they were not the Empire's invaders. Sulu knew that his tactical command was a blank piece of paper full of question marks, so at this time, he calmly and naturally retreated 90 kilometers away. Du Shaoqing, who was facing Sulu from a distance, felt slightly silent and lonely. He did not think that Sulu's answer would be so simple and direct. Facing the hint of flirting that he deliberately released, she actually willingly admitted defeat. How could a person with such a soft waist be valued so highly by the marshal in that person? However, at this time, Sulu raised his head and defended the officers. It's just that today was the first time the MX was used. The students have no experience, and the troops they commanded were not their own troops, so of course, they were not as strong as the Iron 7th Division. Although they failed, I feel that their performance was not bad. In the future, if they spend more time on the battlefield, they will not lose face for the Federation. As soon as these words were said, the officers who had been in low spirits could not help but straighten their chests. There was an additional trace of gratitude in their eyes as they looked forward, looking at Sulu, who was standing quietly in the group of instructors. Du Shaoqing's deep eyes flashed with a trace of gloominess. Because these words were originally intended for everyone to hear. The Federation and the upper echelons of the military had intended for him to carry out the final summary inspection work. Naturally, there was a deeper meaning to this. They were tacitly allowing and even encouraging him to establish his own authority in the military. In the previous lecture, Du Shaoqing had given these officer students a torrent of abuse, but in reality, he knew better than anyone else that these officer students had endless potential. He knew what kind of role they would play in the federal army system in the future battlefield. Harsh lectures and ridicule were not his goal. His goal was to subdue these arrogant fellows. In his vision, he would crush all of these officers' arrogance with a storm. Then he would change the topic. When they were at their lowest, he would give them confidence and beat their hearts and minds. Like the spring breeze after a storm, he would capture their hearts and minds. Only then would he be able to leave the great name of Du Shaoqing in the hearts of the future young forces of the federal military. Seeing himself as the spring breeze, as the sun, Du Shaoqing's state of mind was very normal. He believed that he had the qualifications to become the unsetting sun of the federal military in the future. Now that he was a famous general of the Federation and the commander of the Iron 7th Division, he was already the target of admiration and worship in the eyes of the Federation officers. With a little beating, he would naturally be able to easily achieve his goal. However, after a series of tactical deductions, he suppressed the most famous Zhou until his face turned slightly pale. The entire audience was silent. Just as Commander Du Shaoqing was about to change the topic and appease the crowd, someone extremely untimely and impudently disrupted the course he had planned. Then there was another person who stole his lines. What made him even angrier was that the person who stole his lines just had to be that very unpleasant person, Sulu. The clear sound of footsteps rang out in the quiet field. Pa pa pa. The sound of the hard military boots hitting the ground was crisp but not loud. However, what was strange was that when all the officers, including Sulu, looked at Commander Du, who was slowly walking over from the end of the line, they felt that his footsteps were exceptionally heavy and powerful. It was as if a heavy black mecha was walking out of a smoke-filled valley. Du Shaoqing walked to the center of the line and stared at Sulu through his sunglasses. He didn't say anything for a long time. Sulu took 2 steps forward and gave a military salute. He also didn't say anything. The smile on his face was completely gone. He calmly and solemnly narrowed his eyes. It was as if the sun was about to set and was burning his retinas. He felt a little uncomfortable. This kind of deathly silence and the feeling of almost confrontation made all the officers in the field feel a strong pressure. The trainees were very worried about this bastard, Instructor Xiao Su, but they didn't have the right to stand up and say anything. The instructors wanted to say a few words on behalf of Su Lu, but under this kind of pressure, no one dared to stand up. Even those undisciplined and strong members of Team 7 behind Su Lu were intimidated by the cold aura exuding from Du Xiaoqing in this instant. A person's reputation was like the shadow of a tree. A cold general of the federal military, the youngest major general, just by standing at the front of the line, he was able to exude a boundless sense of pressure. After a long silence, Du Xiaoqing finally opened his mouth to speak. The words that came out of his thin lips were cold and sharp. A lieutenant colonel and a mecha instructor. You admit that you don't know anything about tactical deduction, but you stand up for your students and challenge my judgment. Was it the Ministry of Defense or the Joint Chiefs of Staff who gave you this guts and this authority? The military camp was a simple and direct world. Even though Du Xiaoqing was the youngest division commander in the Federation, the only major general, the most standard professional soldier, and the most idol-level figure, once he was enraged, he still walked the simple and direct path without so many twists and turns. His words were not as sharp as knives. They were like a bucket of ice water that had been splashed directly onto Su Li's head, sending a chill down his spine. Su Li clasped his hands behind his back and lowered his head slightly. The dim light of dusk shone on his resolute and calm face. He didn't say anything to retort, keeping his head lowered so as not to meet Du Xiaoqing's eyes, but he also didn't give off the feeling that he was surrendering. It was probably this attitude that caused Du Xiaoqing's mood to darken. He glanced at the members of Team 7 behind Su Lu and said coldly, "You are no longer part of the 17th Division. You are just a bunch of trash. Don't embarrass the marshal." Su Lu wasn't moved by these words, because he wasn't part of the 17th Division to begin with. However, the faces of those fellows behind him were filled with anger. Du Xiaoqing, however, didn't look at them anymore. He turned his head to stare at Su Lu and scolded him coldly, "Trash is trash. You are also trash." Hearing the word trash, Su Lu vaguely caught on to something. Other than Park Ji-ho, who had died at Hushan Road, and the 2 Iron 7th Division officers who had been heavily injured by him and couldn't participate in the graduation parade, Du Xiaoqing's intention to humiliate him probably had something to do with this. But was this because of his pride as an ace officer of the Federation, or did it have something to do with that old man in Philadelphia? "I don't know why the Ministry of National Defense would take in a criminal," Du Xiaoqing said darkly, "but you actually used the name of an instructor to heavily injure 2 officers of my division during training. Do you really think that the military court won't dare to do anything to you? That I won't dare to do anything to you?" Du Xiaoqing's voice wasn't loud, but every word was like the sound of a cannon as it blasted into Su Li's ears. Su Lu didn't want to go against this strong military man, but when he heard these words, his eyebrows that had already fluttered once raised again. The interaction between people was a very strange thing. If you didn't like someone at first sight, you would not like them for the rest of your life. This was probably the reason why the tiger of the Zhong family in the Westwoods kept suppressing Du Xiaoqing. And Su Lu also had the same feeling when he saw Du Xiaoqing. The coldness of this major general made him very uncomfortable. If a general scolded a lieutenant colonel in any other situation, anyone could only silently accept it, let alone the person who scolded him, was Du Xiaoqing of the Iron 7th Division. But Su Lu was just an ordinary lieutenant colonel. Du Xiaoqing's cold and oppressive aura could make everyone quiet, but it couldn't really press his head down. It should be known that in the room of the military prison in Qingcheng, even the lightning-like gaze of the military god of Philadelphia couldn't break his big heart, let alone other people. So he raised his head, and his slightly squinted eyes were unusually bright against the beautiful sunset in the west. He answered, reporting to Commander Du, "I didn't use the name of an instructor to suppress your subordinates so that they wouldn't dare to fight back, so I took the opportunity to heavily injure them. The investigation report of the base is already out, you can read it yourself." After a slight pause, Su Lu turned his head and looked directly at the sunglasses on Du Xiaoqing's nose bridge. He said loudly, Those two officers once passed on the teachings of the instructor, that a person's strength is the combination of speed and strength. And those two officers also said at the scene of the challenge that the 7th Division often suffered heavy injuries in close combat training, and asked me not to worry about it. So they were heavily injured. This is the result of the fight. If the commander doubts the investigation report of the base, you can let the close combat experts of the 7th Division, or you can try it yourself. The calm and loud voice echoed in the field. Everyone's expression was very interesting, especially the members of the 7th Division and the training officers. Instructor Su's words couldn't be said to be heroic, nor could they be said to be powerful. However, when he said it in such a normal way, the expressions of Du Shaoqing and the other officers of the Iron 7th Division slightly froze at the same time. They had probably never seen a lieutenant colonel who dared to speak to Du Shaoqing like that. Very good, at least you have some guts. Half of Du Shaoqing's face was gloomy. He raised his right hand that was holding a black leather glove and pointed it at Su Li's face. He said, "Violating military regulations and talking back to your superiors. How can a free and lazy person like you be qualified to be a soldier of the Federation? The military camp is not a world for people like you. Leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, if one day you violate the regulations on the battlefield, I will personally destroy you." At this time, Instructor Du's voice was extremely low. Probably only the two people involved could hear it, but Su Li could feel a real sense of danger and coldness in this voice. He knew that Du Shaoqing was speaking the truth. Although he had never found the real reason, he believed that if in the future on the battlefield of the universe, the other party would not hesitate to destroy him if he found some excuse. This feeling of extreme danger made the hair on Su Li's neck stand on end. Just like in the underground parking lot of the Linhai State Gymnasium, just like in the foundation building surrounded by mountains in the 4 states, when he encountered fatal danger, his often smiling eyes would grow brighter and brighter. It was like seeing the first ray of starlight after breaking through the gray clouds of the Donglin region. What could he do when he was coldly reprimanded and threatened by a major general who held military power? There seemed to be only a difference of 2 ranks between a major general and a lieutenant colonel, but there was a deep and almost insurmountable gap between a general and a field officer. Many ambitious professional soldiers eventually fell in front of this abyss. Faced with Du Shaoqing's indifferent ridicule and humiliation, Su Li seemed to have no choice but to listen. However, his eyes grew brighter and brighter. How could he return to calmness? It was at this moment that he thought of Little Watermelon's father, the Westwoods tiger who had suppressed Du Shaoqing for an entire 10 years. When faced with Du Shaoqing and his 7th Division, there was no other way but to be unreasonable, to be incomparably overbearing and violent. Su Li's narrowed eyes were almost as bright as the new moon in the sky. He stared at the black leather glove waving indifferently in front of his nose and suddenly said, "Lambskin?" The black leather glove in Du Shaoqing's hand slowly came to a stop in the evening wind. Bureau HTD doesn't care? The Federation's laws are always a little higher than the military regulations. A hint of a sincere smile appeared on Su Li's face. Violating the regulations, contradicting the superiors, being free and undisciplined, does that mean you don't have the qualifications to be a soldier of the Federation? Then how can someone who brazenly uses lambskin as a glove and violates the Federation's Wildlife Protection Act be qualified to be a teacher? Du Shaoqing looked coldly at Su Li. His expression was as cold as ever, but there seemed to be a hint of mockery at the corner of his mouth. Who in the Federation didn't know that Commander Du of the Iron 7th Division was the role model of a soldier, the standard role model? His style of attire was unparalleled, and his sunglasses and black leather gloves were his style of dress. As a major general, who would dare to question such privilege? Hearing Su Li's words, Du Shaoqing was slightly angered. He said indifferently, "You can ask Bureau HTD to come find me, as long as they dare to interfere with my business." These words were very imposing and arrogant. The Iron 7th Division had always been an imposing, arrogant and protective force. Their commander was even more so. Su Li's question was clearly asking for humiliation. Du Shaoqing's indifferent words revealed a hint of disdain and mockery that couldn't be hidden. About injuring an officer of the Iron 7th Division, contradicting the superiors and violating the regulations, Sulu looked at Du Xiaoqing's sunglasses and said calmly, "You can ask the legal department, no, the Ministry of Defense to come find me, as long as they dare to interfere with my business." Whatever Du Xiaoqing said, Sulu said the same thing. Normal Federation laws couldn't control the commander of the Iron 7th Division, but could the military regulations control Sulu? This was a resounding slap to Du Xiaoqing's face. "You have privileges, but I have a father-in-law who is the scapegoat, and a distant relative beside Feiqing Lake. As the saying goes, unreasonable and unreasonable, in the end isn't this what it means to be angry?" Du Xiaoqing's face finally changed. The cedar tree on the mountain began to loosen. Snow rustled and fell, and endless coldness rose. However, just as this major general was about to flip out, Sulu said something that directly slapped him in the face, and also didn't allow him to apply the ointment. He looked straight ahead, his line of sight passing through Du Xiaoqing's ice-like shoulders and side face to look at the last trace of sunset in the distance. He lowered his voice and said, "Don't go crazy anymore. Otherwise, if you really force me to go crazy, what good will it do you? You are a big shot. If you are beaten by me in front of so many people, how humiliating will it be for you? How can you be the second army god of the Federation in the future? I believe you know that I can fight very well. Your bodyguards didn't have time to shoot? The point is, you are standing too close to me." Sulu withdrew his gaze and looked at Du Xiaoqing. He said softly, "If I beat you until you are disabled, at most I will not be a soldier and be sent to Qingqing to be locked up for a dozen years. I don't care. And you should have investigated me. I can still be pardoned for killing Macklin. I didn't want to be a lieutenant colonel. It was that person in the official residence and that old man who asked me to be a lieutenant colonel." Sulu lowered his voice and finished this long paragraph, which was rare for him. Then he took a deep breath and said with narrowed eyes, "Reporting to Commander, please allow me to not flip out." No one present heard what Sulu said. They only noticed that Commander Du Xiaoqing had retracted his hands behind his back and clenched them tightly. The black lambskin glove on his left hand was clenched so tightly that it was somewhat deformed. Du Xiaoqing stared at Sulu's face and was silent for a long time. When the anger in his heart gradually turned into a kind of cold emotion, he smiled slightly and said, "Good, very good. You are indeed the second person who dares to threaten me to my face after that savage in the West Woods." Everyone was silent. Night fell and everyone was shocked and confused. Commander Du Xiaoqing of the Iron 7th Division had never smiled in his entire life in the military camp, but today he smiled. What was his current state of mind? Chapter 336. Power, glory, and wealth were all things that Sulu liked, but he didn't feel that they were indispensable. Some of the things that he truly cared about had already been blown away by the wind in front of the Parliament building, while the other parts were firmly reborn in a certain building or a dark prison cell. Those things that he cared about the most were not things that could be forcibly taken away by external forces. Thus, for the current him, he had nothing to lose, so he naturally had nothing to fear. His eyes narrowed, and the strict social order and certain unbreakable rules of the military camp were crushed by his eyelids. Back in the day, the Feiqiang brute had once caused the Empire's emperor to bleed and fall in a fit of anger. The Federation's ancient proverb had a similar saying. Du Xiaoqing wasn't the Empire's emperor, and Sulu wasn't Li Pifu, but Sulu truly did have a bit of the swift and fierce aura beneath his cheerfulness, as well as the ability to launch an explosive strike. This displayed a deterrent force. Teacher Du's status was dignified, cold, and tyrannical. He had great ambitions and great aspirations, so he naturally couldn't fight with an unreasonable barefoot man like Sulu. This was a natural imbalance and weakness. Sulu had helped the Federation choke a poisonous seed of the Empire to death. However, after the incident, many of the Federation's top politicians, as well as the upper echelons of the 7 great families, developed a strong sense of vigilance toward him. They even wanted to erase his existence precisely because of this reason. For a stable society, someone like Sulu who had the strength to challenge a certain order, and dared to do so, was not a good thing. The stable structure that human society relied on was the order and arrangement of social strata. Someone who threatened this order absolutely could not be allowed. Even that old man from Feiqiang, if he wasn't a military god who had established outstanding military service for the Federation, If he wasn't surrounded by truly vicious Empire invaders at the other end of the universe, it was likely that the Federation would have long acted like a living creature, trying to expel the mutated cells in its body. Lady Tai knew that Su Li's threat to the Federation didn't only lie in his intentions and ability, but also in a deeper layer of relationship. Thus, her desire to erase Su Lu was stronger than anyone else's. However, as of now, Su Lu was still alive and well. Du Shaoqing smiled for the first time in the military camp. His smile was filled with faint self-mockery, because he was very clear that Su Li's threat was indeed something that he was very afraid of. Facing an expert who did not care about rules, using military rules to pressure him was simply impossible. Since that was the case, how could he fly into a rage? But in the end, Du Shaoqing was still Du Shaoqing, a famous general with a slight self-deprecating smile. He was more frightening than ever before, but he was able to forcibly suppress the madly growing anger in his heart and did not lose his composure at all. He just stared at Su Lu in front of him and then slowly took off his sunglasses. Deep in his eye sockets, his gaze was deep and cold, like a deep mining pit on some mineral planet. Methane and snow were accumulated there, reflecting the bright background of the universe, giving people a feeling that they couldn't bear the coldness. I heard that you were the one who successfully developed the MX? Du Shaoqing stared into Su Li's eyes and said, as a famous general of a generation, being able to judge the situation and be brave enough to make a decisive decision was a form of true military wisdom. In just a few seconds, he had calmed down and accepted Su Li's threat that neither side would fly into a rage. The officers present all knew of Su Li's important role in the development of the MX mecha, so they didn't show any shock at these words. Su Lu let out a small sigh of relief. Just as he was about to explain something, he heard Du Shaoqing continue calmly. In the first test battle of the MX mecha on Kachifeng, you completely defeated Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. I think that your understanding of the MX mecha should be number one in the Federation. Under the influence of President Sieg and Lady Tai, the details of the MX mecha battle at the old moon base had always been kept a secret. The Federation's military only knew that in that battle, the Nutshell Engineering Department had won against the Federation's Academy of Sciences, and the MX mecha had been finalized. However, they never knew who those two extremely powerful mecha pilots were. In the training base, Zhou Yu had known the truth, and the members of Team 7 had also vaguely understood some of it from Secretary Bai's mouth. However, most people did not know this. Right now, hearing Instructor Du say it calmly, they finally understood that their mecha instructor was actually someone who could defeat the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia, that crazy genius. The lined-up officers stared at Instructor Little Su in shock, somewhat unable to believe their own ears. Thinking back to how they had been trying to use mecha to challenge their instructor these past few months, they couldn't help but feel a sense of shame and fear. Su Lu knew why Du Shaoqing would bring up his most outstanding achievement at this time. He looked at the other, frowned slightly, and said, reporting to Instructor, "This is a Federation secret. 3 days ago, the details of the battle at Kachifeng have already been declassified." Du Shaoqing looked at him expressionlessly. A strange feeling grew in Su Li's heart. He wasn't sure what the cold and callous instructor in front of him meant by saying all this. Right then, Du Shaoqing continued coldly, "I heard that you were personally recruited into the army by the Lord Marshal." In the past few decades, the Federation had only had 2 marshals. One was the current president, but no one would directly address him as the Grand Marshal. The other was the actual marshal. Although that old man had already resigned from all his military positions many years ago, returning to the shores of Lake Philadelphia to watch the water, the mountains, the snow, the fish, and the world, everyone in the Federation, especially the soldiers, would respectfully refer to this old man as the marshal whenever they mentioned him. Du Shaoqing's words shocked the officers present even more than the 2 facts he had revealed earlier. Su Lu looked at this person's deep gaze in slight surprise, but he could already hear the sounds of discussion coming from behind him. To be personally chosen by the Great War God and specially recruited into the army, this was more glorious than any other kind of glory. The officers looked at Instructor Su with shock and curiosity. Even the excellent military posture they had been maintaining all this time was somewhat scattered. Du Shaoqing looked at Su Lu expressionlessly. He was forced by this seemingly ordinary man to the point that he couldn't flip out. The anger in his chest turned into a stifled knife, almost cutting his heart and lungs. He directly admitted that the other party had the qualifications to make him unable to flip out, and then announced to the crowd. Then the teacher changed the topic and returned to the topic at the beginning. You previously thought that the students didn't use the MX machine, and you are undoubtedly the most experienced soldier. Du Xiaoqing said lightly. Marshal Li admires you a lot. If you say that you don't know how to make tactical deductions, who would believe that? If you were the one attacking today, how would you attack? The words were as cold as ice, but no one could stop them. Du Xiaoqing's strategy was amazing, and no one could compare to his detailed deductions. He had actually used the commanding techniques on the battlefield at this moment. If I can't use military rank to suppress you, I'll use logic to suppress you. In just 3 sentences, Du Xiaoqing had pushed Su Lu to the front of everyone's burning gazes, pushing him to a certain height. You are the developer of the MX mecha. You are the strong person who defeated Madman Li. You are the person personally groomed by the great marshal. If Su Lu still said that he didn't know how to respond at this time, who would believe him? With Su Li's personality, if he didn't know how to respond, he wouldn't. He wasn't particularly afraid of losing face, but at this time, Du Xiaoqing had connected him to the Lees of Philadelphia, so he couldn't help but be cautious. The reason he could survive and leave the dark military prison was all because of that old man. Although he viewed that old man as a distant relative in his heart, he knew very well that the upper echelons of the federal military all saw him as someone the great war god would focus on grooming. Otherwise, why would Deputy Commander E be so cordial with a small fry like him during the ceremony this morning? It had nothing to do with protecting the glory of the Lees of Philadelphia. Su Lu just didn't want that old man's vision to be questioned by Du Xiaoqing. He also didn't want to become a silent rock after throwing a tantrum, so he wanted to answer Du Xiaoqing's question about the military drill. The heavens pitied him. Su Lu was really a rookie when it came to military tactics. Even if Du Xiaoqing wasn't personally in command today, how many generals in the Federation dared to say that they could break through the joint defense of the Iron 7th Division? How could he break through? After a moment of silence, Su Lu raised his head to look at Du Xiaoqing and said, I don't know how to make tactical deductions, so I will let Zhou Yu continue to be in full command, just like how the situation developed during the day. To break through the combined defense of the Iron 7th Division, he had no way at all, so he could only let Zhou Yu continue to be in command, and then repeat Du Xiaoqing's murderous command judgment, and then make a strange move saying that he would use 8 MX series to break through the enemy's headquarters. In any case, it was all said with his mouth, so there was no way to prove that he was lying. Su Lu thought in his heart. At this moment, the spirit of Mr. Shi the rogue, little brother Wei the Jianghu Wei, the former rogue orphan, possessed him. Very good, very funny. Du Xiaoqing looked at Su Lu and said coldly, Who in this world can do it? Marshal Li did it before, Su Lu replied after a moment of silence, but in his heart, he was thinking that the uncle should also have this ability. Back then, Li Pifu had controlled the M37 mecha to launch a surprise attack thousands of li away, and kill the emperor of the empire. Compared to controlling the new MX mecha to break through a division and destroy a division, it was undoubtedly many times more difficult. A glimmer of light appeared in Du Xiaoqing's deep eyes. He had originally been prepared to say that the marshal was already old, but when the words reached his mouth, they became the following sentence. Still having the marshal on the battlefield is in itself the greatest humiliation of our Federation soldiers. Who else but the marshal can come up with such a ridiculous tactical design like yours? Do you really think you can? Su Lu lowered his head slightly and was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he thought of the brilliance that spread throughout the universe and said softly, Maybe. I can. The field was silent, awkward silence. The officers woke up from the shock of Su Li's 3 brilliant battle achievements. After some thought, they confirmed that Instructor Su's tactical deduction could not be said to be daring. It was pure nonsense. Even if he was given 80 mecha, he still might not be able to get close to the Iron 7th Division's division headquarters. However, at this time when they heard that Su Lu actually really thought that he could, they could not help but feel awkward. In the gradually darkening night and in the strange atmosphere, Instructor Du Xiaoqing laughed once again. His slightly mocking smile contained undisguised coldness and disgust. As a representative of the academic faction of the federal military, He had always believed that on the battlefield, strategy and tactics were the key to determining victory and defeat. An individual's bravery would always be the bravery of an ordinary person, unable to determine the overall situation. It was precisely because of this unbreakable belief that Du Shaoqing was somewhat dismissive of Sulu and the new MX Mecha that the federal military valued so much. Today's graduation demonstration seemed to have proven his belief. However, at this time, Sulu actually dared to say that he could defeat the Iron 7th Division's division headquarters with just 8 MX Mecha. What kind of ridiculous and irresponsible nonsense was this? Did he need to use ironclad facts to educate this shameless person in front of him? Du Shaoqing stared coldly at Sulu. Most of the participating troops had already left, and Iron 7th Division was only left with a full battalion. However, he believed that even a well-trained full battalion would be enough to trap and kill 8 MX Mecha. Looks like you're really stupid when it comes to tactical deduction. Du Shaoqing took a deep breath and thought about the instructions of that big shot in the capital before he left. He decided to let Sulu off the hook for now. After saying this, he turned around and left, still as cold as ever. On the other hand, a few of the officers of the 3rd Military Region looked at Sulu with disdain as if they were looking at the biggest idiot in the world. Sulu didn't angrily call for the other to come back and compete with him. Instead, he was somewhat glad that Iron 7th Division didn't allow him to hold another military drill to see if his tactical deduction could succeed. His military boots were already soaked. Relying on 8 MX Mecha to fight an entire battalion of mechanics that was really an idiot. Even if the Special Forces mixed 8 MX Mecha, they still wouldn't be able to defeat a division headquarters. You really dare to talk nonsense? To everyone's surprise, from the side of the rostrum, a group of black officers walked over. Surrounded by those generals, they were the Defense Minister Zhou Yingxing and the 1st Military Region's commanding officer, General Miles. Du Shaoqing, who was just about to leave, paused and stopped in his tracks. Under the shocked and confused gazes of the crowd, General Miles smiled and said, "Shaoqing, didn't the 7th Division still leave a battalion behind? Let this guy try to defeat a battalion." Just as he was thinking of taking the blame for his father-in-law, this person really came to take the blame for him. Thinking too much, Sulu only came back to his senses when he heard Shimanjin promise to complete the mission. His lips parted slightly and his eyes subconsciously narrowed. From the beginning until now, it seemed like no one had asked for his opinion. It should be known that if such a small-scale military exercise was really designed, the person who would be piloting the MX to attack the opposing division would be him. However, even Du Shaoqing had no choice but to temporarily restrain his coldness and arrogance in front of the federal military's will. How could he object? With just one sentence from General Miles, the base, which had already become quiet, began to bustle again. The staff officers of the 1st Military Region Staff Officer Unit once again returned to the Military Exercise Command Hall and began to design and adjust the military exercise data model. They were so busy that they did not even have time to eat dinner. As these staff officers designed the military exercise plan, they also felt that it was hilarious and ridiculous. Using 8 MX mechas to attack an entire battalion. With this sort of power difference, no matter how perfect the military exercise command center's plan was, it would not be able to achieve a complete balance. Most of the participating troops had already left the base on military aircraft. The main forces of the Iron 7 Division had already embarked on their journey back to System S3. In today's military exercise, the MX Mecha had already demonstrated their formidable combat prowess. If this had been a normal military exercise, the staff officers might have really believed that these 8 MX Mecha would be able to take down an entire battalion's defensive line. But the problem was that the last battalion left in the base was the Iron 7 Division's most ferocious all-mecha defense battalion. All the officers of the Federation knew that the strength of the Iron 7 Division was mainly due to Division Commander Shaoqing, followed by a group of outstanding officers led by Shimanjin, and the most ferocious of all was the All-Mecha Defense Battalion. In many military exercises in the past, the Iron 7 Division had never mobilized the defense battalion by the division commander's side. Once this battalion was mobilized, it meant that the other side had indeed performed extremely well. But at the same time, the military exercise was about to end. The Iron 7 Division's defense battalion was nominally an entire battalion, but in reality, if you included the mechanical repair company and the individual logistics system, this battalion was extremely overstaffed. When these military staff officers had nothing to do, they had done some calculations on their combat power. If the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion was fully mobilized, they would actually have the combat power of an independent regiment. The time for this sudden small-scale military exercise was set for the next morning. However, the military staff officers busied themselves for half the night and still couldn't come up with a plan for the military exercise. This was because in the past military exercises, there had never been such a strange design. After a long time of frustration, the staff officers of the Military Exercise Command Center decided to revise the original plan. After consulting with their superiors, they added in a data simulation. With the help of the Federal Central Computer, they designed their own virtual military force. Only then did they barely manage to pass the military exercise plan. One side of the military exercise was the Iron 7 Division's Defense Battalion and a virtual support team. The other side was the virtual battalion commanded by the officer cadets and the 8 MX mechas led by Su Lu. While the staff officers were busy, Su Lu and the officer cadets were eating dinner in the cafeteria of the base. After the sudden confrontation in the afternoon, the members of Team 7, who called themselves the 17 Mechanics, had already shed their initial suspicion and uneasiness towards Su Lu. Under the lead of Xiong Linquan, they clamored and yelled as they sat at his table. As for the other officer cadets, their impression of instructor Xiao Su had also undergone a fundamental change. They all sat at the table beside him with smiles on their faces. Thus, the scene in the cafeteria was very interesting. With Su Li's table as the center, 50 to 60 soldiers sat neatly in a circle. Although everyone had smiles on their faces, those smiles were actually very forced. Tomorrow morning, these officer cadets would once again walk onto the simulated battlefield of the military exercise, and Su Lu would have to lead the 8 MX mechas to complete that seemingly impossible mission. Today, the military transferred 3 mechanics over. Although the 2 reserve divisions are only used to set up the simulated battlefield and exert pressure, they can't be deployed to the lonely mountain area. But after all, we are commanding 3 divisions. If we lost so badly against the Iron 7 Division, I have even less confidence in commanding tomorrow morning. Zhou Yu put down the utensils in his hands and said with a complicated expression, Commander Du's tactical deduction has no loopholes. Although Shimin Jin will be commanding tomorrow, in reality, the Iron 7 Division is still his division regardless of whether he is there or not. I can't find any loopholes in their plan. As for the surprise attack by the MX mechas, if it was a true surprise attack, perhaps there would be some chance of success. But this impromptu military exercise has already clearly indicated that you are going to launch a surprise attack, so the other side will definitely be prepared to deal with it. There is no way we can succeed in this kind of ridiculous military exercise. Su Lu lowered his head and ate silently, not saying a word. He could feel the atmosphere in the cafeteria. The officer cadets had never had the experience of commanding a large unit by themselves, especially freshly graduated students like Zhou Yu. No matter how talented he was, the gap between him and instructor Du Xiaoqing could not be closed. At this time, everyone no longer had much confidence in themselves. After General Miles somewhat unreasonably confirmed the impromptu military exercise, Su Lu noticed that Du Xiaoqing was looking at him coldly. With his ability to judge people's hearts, he actually felt a trace of murderous intent. The burning zhenqi in his body immediately began to circulate, becoming extremely sensitive. Su Li's mood was somewhat gloomy and slightly angry. Although Du Xiaoqing had not been able to fly into a rage today, which had caused him to lose face, and because of Park Ji-ho and other matters, it was difficult for him to coexist peacefully with the Iron 7 Division. But the other party had actually wanted to kill him. This made him feel incomprehensible and uneasy. Just as he was about to comfort the student who was forcing a smile, he saw Secretary Jiao walk in and use his eyes to signal for him to follow him out. Minister Zhou wants to see you. Secretary Jiao had met Su Lu a few times and was no stranger to him. He also knew that the person in front of him often went in and out of the Shishan Zhou family. Su Lu was slightly startled. He did not understand why Minister Zhou wanted to see him at such a tense time before the military exercise. Was he not afraid of the speculation and discussion within the military? Sit. In the high-rise suite of the training base, Zhou Yingxing took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose and calmly waved his hand at Su Lu, indicating that he should sit on the sofa beside the bed. This big shot who had suddenly risen to power in the Federation, whether it was in charge of logistics in the General Assembly base, or cautiously holding his tail between his legs as the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of National Defense, or now that he had become a real big shot with great power in the federal military, his expression was always so calm and peaceful. There was not the slightest change because of his rise in rank and power. Su Lu sat down and looked at Zhou Yingxing in front of him. He suddenly thought of a year ago at the Milky Way Public Cemetery when they first met. They should not have been familiar with each other, but because of the black pot they became familiar with each other. Looking at the white hair on Zhou Yingxing's mane, Su Lu felt a little emotional. He thought that Minister Zhou probably had to bear a lot of pressure between the government and the back mountain. Teacher Xiaoqing is talented, courageous, and capable, so it is natural for him to be proud and cold. As a soldier of the Federation, you have to admit that he is a model soldier. No matter from which angle you look at it, it is difficult for you to find fault with him. Zhou Yingxing looked at him gently and said, "The president and the new members of the parliament all admire him." After casually mentioning this powerful minister did not say anything else, nor did he blame Su Lu for his performance today. In the past year, Su Lu had often gone to the West Mountain compound to eat, and had also had a few deep and simple conversations with the other in the study. He had gradually gotten used to this style of speaking, but he was extremely sensitive to some hidden meaning in Minister Zhou's words. It was difficult to find fault with Du Xiaoqing. Did this mean that some people in the upper echelons of the military had been trying to find fault with the Iron 7th Division? On the surface, the data shows that only 27 MX mecha have been made, but in reality, the General Assembly Base and the Nutshell Engineering Department have already made 230 MX mecha. Minister Zhou calmly changed the topic and said, "The relevant military mechanics have also been receiving training in Hong Kong. The ones in charge of the training are Shang Qiu, whom you know, and those companions who worked with you all those years ago." Su Lu nodded. The Federation had sent Shang Qiu and the others to train mechanic engineers, while he was sent here to train pilots. With both sides working together at the same time, the actual large-scale equipment of MX should be able to be brought forward. It was just that he did not really understand why he had to train so harshly in their mecha abilities when the training officers were trained according to the standards of their commanding officers. Why did the military not let him train the original pilots of the various units? Fitting out a new mecha is a comprehensive project. It cannot be rushed. Zhou Yingxing's brows showed signs of fatigue. He said, "But no one knows how much data the Empire has on those two corridors. When will the first shot be fired in the West Woods? So the military must hurry. The department has seen the teaching materials you wrote in the base and admired them very much. Especially your statement that the pilots themselves should also be excellent mechanics. The Federation cannot immediately train tens of thousands of ready-made mechanics. If the people who operate the mecha have a deeper understanding of the mecha, this problem can be solved. After some modifications to your teaching materials, they will be sent to the 4 great military academies." Zhou Yingxing seemed to be in a better mood. He looked at him with a smile and said, "I knew you could design mecha, but I didn't expect your theoretical level of mecha operation to be so good." Su Lu was a little embarrassed. He had never formally learned how to operate mecha. He had only memorized a lot of it in Yue University. Coupled with the advanced testing system in H1, he had been able to rely on his deep knowledge of mechanics and his understanding of the MX to come up with this set of teaching materials. He had not expected that this set of teaching materials, which he had been forced to write, would actually be used by the military. In the past, the official data stated that there were only 400 M-series mecha. How many are there really? Su Lu thought back to what Minister Zhou had said earlier, and suddenly his heart skipped a beat. He had a close relationship with this important person in front of him. He could not help but want to know the big question he had when he was reading the weapons magazines in Donglin. 3,400 units. And it's still increasing at the rate of 20 units a day. Minister Zhou rested both his hands on the sofa and replied with a smile. The MX is a brand new system. The main assembly base and nutshell don't have enough production lines, and the cost is too high. The old M-series mecha will still play a big role in future battles. Hearing this number, Su Li's heart shook. So the Federation had been hiding its true strength all this time. And looking at the trace of emotion and satisfaction on Minister Zhou's face, he remembered that this general had always been in charge of the Federation's logistics system. The astonishing number of mecha and the powerful ability to deliver supplies should be the condensation of the other's life's work and his greatest pride. Everyone knew that logistics were the key to war. And the Federation had appointed a general with a logistical background as the Federation's Minister of Defense. No matter how much of this involved, the strong recommendation of Macho Yingxing and President Pabre's balancing act, it at least proved that the Federation was changing some big concepts. Summoning him here in the middle of the night naturally couldn't be just to talk about some Federation secret numbers or daily life. Su Lu thought to himself that tonight's conversation would definitely have something to do with the MX mecha. These training officers and the Japanese military exercise this time are actually the plans drawn up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff after the MX mecha standard was officially confirmed half a year ago. Minister Zhou looked at him calmly and asked, "Do you know the true purpose of this military exercise?" Su Lu shook his head. War is a war of people and also a war of equipment. A revolutionary weapon will bring about a revolutionary change in the thinking of war. Unfortunately, the MX appeared too late, and the war is just around the corner. There isn't much time for the federal military generals to gradually discover the importance of the MX and gradually change the inherent tactical guiding ideology. To change the established thinking they learned from the 4 major military academies is a very difficult thing. This bend, no matter who tries, it will be very difficult to turn it around. But we need to consider what kind of situation we will face if the Empire's new mecha has already been successfully developed. Zhou Yingxing said with a serious expression, "In the future, the frontline commanders must learn a completely new commanding ideology in terms of attack and defense. Attack, they must maximize the mobility of the MX mecha. Defense, they must learn how to face the highly mobile close-range attacks of the new mecha. All the generals in the military must have a deep understanding that in the future battlefields of the planetary continent, the mecha is the most important thing." Zhou Yingxing's tone was calm, but it carried a trace of an air that brooked no resistance. This was the long-term plan of the top brass of the federal military, the crystallization of their collective wisdom, and also the general trend of the federal army's reform. "The reason why I didn't let you train the original pilots but instead train these commanders is to spread this attitude towards the MX mecha to all the troops through these officers. In the future, when this batch of officers grows up, they will become staunch supporters of the theory of mecha dominance. This is also the mission President Pabre and the military has given you." Hearing these words, Su Lu could not help but feel his mind waver. He had not expected that he would actually be involved in such an important matter. He pursed his lips and then said seriously, "The students have learned very well. In today's military exercise, the Special Mecha Battalion led by Hua Xiaoxi has already displayed the capabilities of the MX mecha. It's still too far from the requirements of the joint conference." Zhou Yingxing shook his head coldly and said, "Zhou, you clearly had a 70% chance of getting to the opponent's command center. They clearly knew where the MX's deep penetration ability was, but they were still limited by their inherent tactical discipline and ideology. They only dared to attack the backup mecha base of Iron 7 Division, not daring to directly attack the division headquarters. The division headquarters might have failed because they were facing the Iron 7 Division. But in this military exercise, the Joint Conference had originally hoped to display the capabilities of the MX mecha to shake the old ideology of the spectating officers. Unfortunately, the MX's capabilities were only partially displayed. The officers present and watching from afar were not truly moved. Minister Zhou rubbed his forehead tiredly and sighed softly. He said, without being moved from the depths of one's heart, "It is very difficult to adjust the strategic thinking of an army. This is especially true for this group of academic officers, led by Commander Xiaoqing. They still firmly believe that strategy is the most important thing on the battlefield. Of course, the Joint Conference will definitely not oppose this ideology, but they will need to make adjustments." In fact, one of Commander Xiaoqing's personal guard camps is filled with mecha. He understands the importance of equipment better than anyone else, but he has always been proud of his daily training and commanding, so he subconsciously does not want to admit this point. Zhou Yingxing said calmly, "This is also the real reason why Admiral Miles and I came to the base. After your impromptu military exercise ends tomorrow, there will be a senior general meeting immediately. The 4 main armies and the Federal Fleet will be connected remotely." Sulu stared blankly at the department head sitting on the sofa. Only now did he realize that the impromptu military exercise in the early hours of the morning was not because of the trivial matter between him and the Iron 7 Division. It had such a profound meaning. He suddenly felt a little cold. His voice was slightly hoarse as he said, "A super defense battalion full of mechas. I can't win. The joint conference is not asking you to fight the Iron 7 Division, just one camp. The military exercise plan is already out. Both sides will divide up the simulated forces and try to get as close as possible. Other than those military cadets, the 7th group will also be assigned to you." Minister Zhou waved his hand dismissively and said, "In truth, no one expects you to win. They just hope that even if you lose beautifully. You need to use ironclad facts to warn those generals that anyone who underestimates the usefulness of the MX mecha will definitely end up in a sorry state. On the battlefield, that is a tragic sight to behold." He was going to fight a battle that was destined to be unwinnable, just to vent his anger and make the other side suffer heavy losses. This would leave a shadow in the hearts of the generals. Sulu felt that this matter was a little ridiculous. Furthermore, he knew that he would lose, but he still had to lose to the bastard Iron 7 Division. Thinking of Du Xiaoqing's extremely cold and murderous eyes, Sulu felt a wave of anger rise in his heart. He said, "Can I not go? You have already signed the contract to sell your body." Zhou Yingxing looked at Sulu and his brows furrowed slightly. He knew in his heart that such a request was unreasonable for this person. Regardless of the outcome, if Sulu were to beat the opponent into a pulp, he would definitely offend Du Xiaoqing, who had the most limitless future in the Federation military, as well as the incomparably iron-blooded 7th Division. Thinking of this, Minister Zhou's gaze softened. Thinking of the relationship between his daughter and the man in front of him, a complicated thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Sulu was single and so was Yuzi. Anyway, Lu Hua's father was this fellow's name. "If, after this matter is done, come over for a meal," Minister Zhou said casually. Sulu nodded gloomily. However, he thought that after this matter was done, the government should send Mr. Sure a special pardon, right? Thinking of this, he smiled and asked, "How's Lu Hua's appetite now?" "Very good at eating," Minister Zhou said calmly. In the warehouse on the other side of the base, the atmosphere was solemn and heavy. In the extremely spacious warehouse, 700 Federation soldiers were nervously but orderly making the final preparations before the battle. Some people cleaned up their guns, removed the real ammunition, and replaced it with digital analog signal generators. The self-propelled armored vehicles' engines began to roar. In the innermost part of the warehouse, dozens of black M52 mechas were like iron giants, coldly watching the people in the warehouse. The busy mechanical engineers beside the mechas were shouting something through the intercom, and all kinds of equipment were moving in and out. If the Iron 7th Division was the trump card of the 3rd Military Region, the trump card that the Federation regrettably didn't go through the test of war, then the local defense unit that had always followed Du Xiaoqing was the trump card of the trump card. Whether it was the equipment or the quality of the soldiers, they were second to none in the entire military. They were extremely excellent, and they had always been under the command of the best military officers. Although it wasn't a real battle, the soldiers of the local defense unit were abnormally solemn. They treated any drill as a real battle, especially this impromptu drill that was about to begin in the early morning. It was related to the glory of Division Commander Xiaoqing and the entire Iron 7th Division. Many people already knew about the story between the lieutenant colonel named Sulu and their division commander on the field. Their hearts were filled with anger, and they decided to directly smash the troops led by that reckless lieutenant colonel into pieces. Following a sharp beep of an alarm, the armored vehicles and the M52 mecha that had switched to moving mode began to rumble forward, crushing the hard and special ground as they moved into the night, heading towards the designated area of the military exercise headquarters to set up defenses. Division Commander, why did you agree to the Ministry of Defense's request? Everyone knows that Kid is the future son-in-law of the head of the military. Our Iron 7th Division is not a tool to play games with other people. A lieutenant colonel stood beside Division Commander Du Xiaoqing and said angrily. Du Xiaoqing was silent and didn't answer. He only glanced at Xi Minjin beside him to confirm that this subordinate of his that he admired the most didn't have any intention of underestimating the enemy. He nodded his head in satisfaction. There are no games on the battlefield. Du Xiaoqing said coldly, Ximen, fight well. Yes, Division Commander. Xi Minjin replied in a low voice and then followed his troops into the darkness. Watching the local defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division gradually disappear into the darkness, listening to the faint sounds of mechas tearing through the forest and the rumbling of tanks in the distance, Du Xiaoqing's deep eye sockets suddenly became cold, but it immediately turned into a trace of indescribable complex emotions. Many people, including his subordinates, thought that this impromptu military drill was a joke, but what kind of person was Du Xiaoqing? Although he was successfully angered by Su Lu, he only needed to calm down for a few minutes to clearly determine the true intentions of the Joint Conference and the Ministry of Defense. This was not a dispute between him and Su Lu. In fact, Su Lu didn't even have the right to challenge his military talent. Du Xiaoqing quietly looked at the dark night, but from this impromptu military drill and the intentions of the military, he thought of something even more profound. Looking at the entire universe, Du Xiaoqing had always had no respect for anyone on the battlefield. Even the tiger in the Westwoods was just a person with courage but no brains in his eyes. Only one person stood in front of him like a mountain, blocking the blue sea, blue sky, and thousands of stars in his eyes. That was the Federation's god of war, Li Pifu. He was not a person who only knew how to be arrogant. His heart was filled with respect and worship for the Federation's god of war. During his military career, he had even regarded Li Pifu as his teacher from afar. But Du Xiaoqing was not an ordinary person. He regarded Li Pifu as his teacher, but he wanted to surpass this teacher who didn't know him and establish his own history on the battlefield. After many years of peace, the Federation urgently needed a hero after the god of war retired to the lakeside of Feiqing. Du Xiaoqing relied on his own talent and his achievements in the Iron 7th Division to become the successor of the god of war. He himself did not contradict this saying. His real thought was, if not me, who else can do it? However, the god of war suddenly left Feiqing, went to the capital special district, and went to the military prison of Qingcheng, all for that kid. That kid even entered the military base and became the instructor of this batch of officers with great potential. Du Xiaoqing's cold eyes flashed with a hint of mockery. Successor? The god of war, Li Pifu, had both military wisdom and supreme bravery. He was the epitome of military talent. Du Xiaoqing took away the word strategy, while Su Lu challenged Li Feng at the top of Cocky Peak and killed Macklin at S2. However, he took away the word bravery from Li Pifu. The marshal shocked the universe back then. In the end, he relied on his bravery to travel thousands of miles to kill the emperor of the empire. Du Xiaoqing looked at the dark night with some loneliness and muttered to himself in his heart. Su Lu was still an inconspicuous instructor, but he already felt threatened. How far would he go in the future? A person specially trained by the army god. Therefore, he wanted to prove to the entire federal military that between strategy and bravery, strategy was the most important thing. This was also why he agreed to the Ministry of National Defense and let his subordinates and Su Lu carry out this military exercise. But in fact, in the deepest part of Du Xiaoqing's heart, he had always been disgusted with the Federation and the military. He respected Li Pifu very much. When he was studying at the First Military Academy, he had calmly thought about this because the god of war would always die. As a person who governed the military, Du Xiaoqing insisted that training, the level of logistical support, the ability to implement tactics, and the unpredictability of strategic intentions were the most important things to kill the enemy on the battlefield. Individual heroism and idol creation could bring an extremely strong combat strength in normal times, but this kind of influence was too heavily relied on. Once the hero or idol died, what would the army do? However, Du Xiaoqing did not notice that at this time, Several soldiers left in the warehouse were secretly looking at him from afar. Looking at the tall and straight figure of their teacher, the eyes of these soldiers were filled with fanatical worship and awe. He himself was already the embodiment of the Iron 7th Division. The plan for the military exercise has been decided. The Iron 7 Division has been given a virtual high-speed missile unit by the central computer. It's a non-cruise system. Although it won't do much damage to the MX mecha, it'll still be a big problem. Our side has only been moved by a virtual reorganization camp. Those digital signals will face the trump card of Iron 7th Division, so we can't place too much hope on them. Besides, the tactical intent this time is too clear. The other side will definitely be on guard against the MX mecha breaking out of camp. If the other side has a thermal activation band monitor, then it will be very difficult for you guys to approach silently. If you guys block all electronic signals, then I can release a few inductive heat sources and try. But the problem is, if you guys block all electronic signals, then you won't be able to receive the satellite map and real-time information from the command center. In this vast mountain range, where will you find the other side's command center? The most important thing is, I might not be able to bet on the location of his command center from the electronic monitoring. Zhou Yu, who was in charge of the overall tactical deduction and specific command, was not as gentle and calm as usual. His brows were furrowed, and his expression was worried as he said, "The local defense camp's equipment is too strong. Although Du Xiaoqing is not well known, I heard that he is Du Xiaoqing's most trusted staff officer. He is still a guard with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and is educated by Du Xiaoqing every day. You can imagine how good his commanding skills are. We will lose without a doubt." "I can't think of any other way," said Zhou Yu directly. The stern-looking officer students beside him began to discuss among themselves. "Instructor Su, what do you suggest?" Hua Xiaoxi noticed the silent Su Lu and asked curiously. With these words, the room instantly fell silent. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then smiled somewhat helplessly and said, "I'm not good at this, but Zhou Yu, can you think of a way to tear open a hole in Iron 7th Division's outer defensive perimeter and open up a path for me? Even if you can tear it open, it won't mean much. 8 MX mecha are too big of a target and will be easily discovered," said Zhou Yu seriously. Su Lu lowered his head slightly, his palm lightly stroking the black workbench beside him. He said, "Hua Xiaoxi, you guys send all 7 MX mecha out in a moment and leave a path for me to sneak in. No matter how strong the MX mecha are, don't expect them to actually be able to break into the opponent's command center." Zhou Yu retorted bluntly, "The internal electronic codes of the federal military are too easy to identify. As mentioned earlier, unless you turn the MX into a blind and deaf person, then there will be some possibility. But for a blind and deaf person, are you prepared to wander around the mountains for an entire day and then admit defeat? I'm going to lose anyway. Just help me leave a hole." Su Lu scratched his head, then turned his head with a wry smile to say to Xiong Linquan and the other 18 men, "You guys follow me. Once you can squeeze into the hole, then spread out and help me cover up." The entire room was silent. The officer students were all excellent all-rounders, but after thinking about it for a while, they still couldn't understand. Other than stupidity, what other adjectives could describe Instructor Xiao Su's design? 5:30 a.m., this strange military exercise officially began. Iron 7th Division's Ace Defense Camp, in just one encounter, displayed even greater combat power than they had displayed during the day. On the battlefield, the interference of radio waves, filtering, and strong and weak signals intertwined with each other in the air without a sound but in an incredibly tragic manner. The moment the ground troops came into contact with each other, the numerical strength of the virtual soldiers on the central computer dropped rapidly under the attack of the local defense battalion, who cut them apart like sharp blades. Zhou Yu stared at the data on the screen with a heavy expression. Only now did he know that Instructor Du Xiaoqing's words were true. During the day, Iron 7th Division had indeed gone easy on them. Right now, the opponent looked like they were really going for it. His own ragtag troops could only hold on for another half an hour at most. Chapter 338. Area 232. 938. 26 has been lost. Simulated Support Team 1 has been wiped out. Red Team's command post has retreated 3 kilometers to the right of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In the underground military exercise command hall of the base, the staff officers of the headquarters of the 1st Military Region were walking back and forth retrieving data for feedback. Then they would use the work platform to perform complicated calculations, turning the real-time situation of the exercise site into a visual image and displaying it on a large holographic screen. The satellite controlled by the Federation's charter computer was faithfully superimposing these images with the real-world map, creating a world full of blood and smoke. These were all simulated data streams, but when displayed on the holographic screen, they turned into dazzling blocks of color. It was especially shocking. The staff officer who kept reporting the current situation had a dull and monotonous voice. It was like the voice of a synthetic robot. There was no change in his emotions. One reason was because staff officers needed to be calm. 2. In the eyes of everyone in the command hall, the failure of Red Team was already a fact of life. The impromptu military exercise had already been going on for 17 minutes. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, which was under the command of Jin, had played the role of Blue Team. From the start of the exercise, they had given everyone a huge shock. In the plan of the exercise, Blue Team, which was supposed to play the role of being attacked by the mechas, suddenly turned out in full force. Their mobile firepower fiercely attacked the valley between the 2 mountain ranges, catching Red Team off guard. Red Team, which was under the command of Zhou Yu and the other military cadets, suffered a huge loss at the start. Although they tried their best and even tried their best to launch counterattacks from every small angle, they were still unable to change the situation of being gradually surrounded. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion perfectly executed Jin's command plan. They used a seemingly simple strategy change to achieve excellent results. It had to be said that to be able to complete such a large-scale change in the darkness before dawn, this unit's training level and combat ability had reached a new level. Jin is not bad. Who said that we have to stay in the barracks obediently? Although these military cadets have been to the front lines before, they have never been the commanding officer of a unit. Especially Zhou Yu, who is in charge of the specific command this time. I heard that he just graduated from No. 1 Academy. In the quiet and solemn command hall, General Myers sat on the sofa with no expression on his face. He drank a cup of hot tea and said to Minister Zhou beside him, but the Red Team reacted quickly. These officers were able to hold on for more than 10 minutes in this situation. Young people are really brave. I can see that their commanding skills are quite good. Minister of Zhou Yingxing nodded and looked at the holographic screen with a serious expression. The cup of tea beside him was still steaming, and he didn't even take a sip. The unit that was supposed to be on the defensive had chosen to attack in a cold and ruthless manner. This didn't violate the rules of the drill. However, the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was able to consecutively attack 3 key areas of the military cadet side in an extremely short period of time. This wasn't entirely due to the lack of preparation on the part of the military cadets. It was because this unit had truly achieved the combat style of a mountain collapsing when they moved. Commander Jin's orders were clear, concise, and powerful. His troops were also very used to this kind of fighting style. Their ability to make use of the terrain and surpass the terrain was indescribably powerful. They had truly pushed the mobility of a fully automated mechanic to the extreme. In front of such an iron-blooded army, the data simulated by the Federation's central computer was obviously nothing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff was most concerned about the performance of the MX mecha. However, in the face of the sharp attacks of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, their hands and feet were completely tied. Minister Zhou looked at the light screen indifferently, and a faint sense of shock arose in his heart. Who would have thought that the commander named Jin would actually place the thermal activation band monitoring equipment at the forefront of the battlefield, and not at the most crucial command center? Moreover, this person had actually turned the armored vehicles, which were originally loaded with electromagnetic beam bombs, into countless explosive packs that would explode with a single trigger. They then charged toward the military officers' front line. Currently, the most effective weapon against mecha was the electromagnetic beam bomb. Perhaps the MX mecha's mobility was enough to mitigate most of the damage, but even an ace pilot would feel fear when he saw that the area he had to pass through was filled with these things. At the 212, 453 front line, if the Iron 7th Division's determination to advance had been delayed by even a second, the MX Mecha on the military cadet side would have been able to pass through this checkpoint. However, at this time, this checkpoint was blocked by the Iron 7th Division without any fear of death. The battle situation on the holographic screen was very tragic. Although the red team under the command of Officer Shang was already showing signs of defeat, those troops were still valiantly defending every line under their command. Once they are captured by electronic surveillance, they will be trapped in the terrain and have to face continuous attacks. How can they survive? If they were to support each other, these 8 MX Mecha would at least contain all of the M-series mecha and half of the self-propelled artillery systems of the Iron 7th Division. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. He said coldly, "I saw that Zhou Yu's command was not bad at all. How could he have made such a stupid mistake?" Minister Zhou smiled slightly and said, "I'm afraid it was Su Li's idea." Admiral Miles was stunned. A faint bitter smile flashed across his slightly red wrinkles due to excitement. The development of the drill was just as the general had predicted. In order to cover the 8 MX Mecha's dispersal, the military officers' command center launched the last virtual airdrop. However, they had no choice but to choose the airdrop location to be in a valley. In the end, they were completely surrounded. On the other hand, Shimin Jin, who was commanding the Iron 7 Division's guards, coldly maintained their military positions in all directions. They carefully deployed their forces, neither too fast nor too slow. However, they stared fiercely at the 7 MX Mechas. A few sure-kill encirclements gradually formed near the light spots that represented the MX Mechas. They were filled with killing intent. Once the encirclement formed by the self-propelled artillery and the mecha was completed, no matter how strong the MX Mecha were, they would not be able to last for long in this kind of rugged, hilly terrain in the middle of the night without any firepower support. The people in the military exercise command center looked at the screen with a sorrowful and emotional gaze. The MX Mecha relied on their mobility to force their way out of the encirclement. However, not long after, they were forcefully surrounded by the indifferent soldiers of the Iron 7th Division. All of their manpower had been invested in the battle on the west side of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In fact, because most of the command center was virtual combat power, most of the officers were even willing to use themselves as staff officers. It was also because of the stubborn resistance of these officers, the cover of the 7 MX Mecha, and even the 18 men of Iron 7 Division, that Su Lu was able to find an opening on the battlefield and sneak in. The red team's last and most intense electronic interference attack was to cover for his breakthrough. Su Lu brought up the electronic map on the screen and looked at it carefully. Unfortunately, even at the last moment before they blocked themselves and cut off all electronic communication, the officers still could not find the location of Iron 7 Division's command center. Shimin Jin was very similar to Du Shaoqing. He did not reveal any loopholes at all. Thinking of these two names, Su Lu felt a chill in his heart. A shadow flashed across his eyes. He knew that Iron 7 Division was an invincible division in the Federation's military exercises. However, only when he was on the battlefield and saw with his own eyes this meticulous, calm, and machine-like, ferocious beast-like force, could he truly understand how terrifying they were. This battle was too tragic. The Iron 7 Division was indeed ferocious. Even though there was only one battalion participating today, they still fought with the resentment and murderous spirit they had accumulated over the years. Their sharpness was unstoppable and indescribably cold. The tiger in the Westwoods had suppressed Du Shaoqing for 10 years, but Du Shaoqing had successfully transformed this emotion into the temperament or soul of an army. Once it was displayed on the battlefield, it was truly terrifying. Moreover, the commander named Shimin Jin was indeed very outstanding. The 18 men of Iron 7 Division who had protected him when they entered the mountain area were indeed able to erupt with power that even Su Lu praised. However, even though they had killed more than 40 enemies, they were all killed in the end. In front of the ruthless Iron 7 Division, the strength of this small group was mercilessly crushed into powder. Not even a speck of dust was left behind. At this moment, Sulu had to admit that Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 division had the right to be proud. His bodyguard, Du Shaoqing, was already so fierce. What if Du Shaoqing was personally in command? After a few deep breaths, he calmed down. After confirming that the electronic shielding system was working properly, he quickly keyed in commands with the fingers of his right hand. His left hand gently pushed the control stick, and the black MX mecha glided to the right in the dense forest. The heavy body of the mecha did not make any noise that would have woken Squirrel. It looked more like a ghost. Under the self-shielding system, the MX mecha did not emit any signals other than the visible and infrared devices. It was also unable to receive any signals. The small semi-aperture radar and SSC search system were also forced to shut down. Right now, the mecha he was operating was like a moving rock. It could not see into the distance, nor could it hear any good news carried by the wind. The cadets did not buy much time for him. Once the command center and the 7 MX mechas were destroyed, the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion would retreat. He would not have any more chances. In this tense moment where every second counted, Sulu did not move. Instead, he closed his eyes. A rock would not always be upright. There were times when it was crazy and there were times when it was shameless. Sulu thought of the chilling aura emanating from Du Shaoqing's body. He thought of what he had seen with his own eyes. He thought of his comrades being utterly defeated by the Iron 7 Division. His hair stood on end. Not only did he have to complete the difficult mission given to him by the military, but also because of the murderous intent that Du Shaoqing had revealed. In the future, if he had to constantly worry about a famous general behind him trying to eliminate him on the battlefield in the Westwoods, it would not be a good life. Therefore, Sulu decided to win this exercise at all costs. He had to suppress the arrogance of the Iron 7 Division, so he decided to cheat. He closed his eyes and stared into the deep darkness. He listened to the smooth and low sounds coming from the cockpit. He said in his heart, "Old thing, I need you to show me the way." There was no response. His mind was blank. There was no white light. There was nothing. This blank state did not last long, but to Sulu, it felt as long as a century. The glory of the Charter was his biggest support in the Federation. It was his biggest secret. Even Uncle Lu would not have guessed such a bizarre thing. However, this was also his biggest fear. He did not understand why the old thing would help him. He also did not know when the old thing would abandon him or even arrest him. 7 seconds. Cold sweat dampened the simulation system on his skin. Sulu finally heard a voice that was usually abnormally old-fashioned. Today, however, it was exceptionally pleasant to the ear. "What is it this time?" If he wanted to, and the old man agreed, he could even peek at the First Lady taking a bath. At this time, it wasn't very difficult to find the calm Lieutenant Colonel Shimin Jin in the middle of the mountains. If he found Shimin Jin, he would find the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division. Turning off all of the mecha's detection equipment, Sulu stared at the holographic screen in front of him with his naked eyes. He controlled the black MX mecha and moved silently through the forest. Following the map points in his eyes, he gradually approached his target. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, like a wolf shooting out the light of its prey in the dark forest. After the MX mecha's automatic electronic shielding, it became a rock in the dark night. Regardless of whether it was the heat it emitted or the electromagnetic wave that leaked out from the dual engines, it was all carefully designed and controlled within an extremely small range. The problem was that the MX in this state had a huge disadvantage. It had lost all of its detection equipment. It could only hide but not launch a surprise attack. However, Sulu, who was controlling the MX, was able to make up for this disadvantage. At 6:13 a.m., a faint ray of light appeared on the horizon, but the surroundings were still pitch black. There were no sounds of birds or insects in the forest, only bursts of light coming from the direction of the yellow mountains in the distance. It looked like the troops commanded by Zhou Yu and those military cadets were still making their last stand. After capturing the location of the Iron 7th Division's headquarters, Sulu used more than 10 minutes to control the Black MX. Like a ghost under the cover of the night, he used his superb control skills to silently climb over 2 steep mountain peaks and approach the enemy's camp. Moreover, looking at the analysis of the dust when the mecha's feet landed on the ground, it was likely that even the sound of the landing would not be too loud. Could this be the true form of the MX mecha? But no matter how advanced the MX mecha was, to be able to run along the mountains at such a high speed and with such stability and serenity, it could only rely on the pilot's superb control skills. In the hands of this pilot, the black mecha's movements were clear and concise, light and agile, exuding an indescribable sense of wonder and beauty. It far surpassed the impression that the average military ace pilot left on others. Who was this pilot? The military exercise command hall was silent. Everyone's eyes were glued to the screen, to the black mecha on the screen, walking silently on the other side of the mountain ridge. Du Xiaoqing had been sitting quietly on the sofa on the far right. Even when the entire hall was in awe of the black MX mecha's silence, he was still unusually calm and cool, not a ripple in his heart. When General Miles and Minister Zhou had thought of the identity of that pilot, he had already determined that the person in the black mecha could only be Su Lu, for someone who could be chosen by the Federation's military god. If he could not display an extraordinary level of strength, then he would actually be a little disappointed. His right hand held the black lambskin glove lightly as he looked coldly at the black mecha on the screen. It was advancing like a leopard cat, as if it had completely escaped the shackles of gravity. A hint of interest flashed through his deep eyes. Running like this, could it be that he would be able to find his troops in the mountains? Although the specific commander of this impromptu military exercise was Shimin Jin, Du Xiaoqing still only thought that this was his troops, and they could not be defeated. On the wide screen, only a black MX mecha could be seen moving forward at full speed, running, jumping, and moving freely and silently among the mountains. The image was a little dull, but what was strange was that even if the two military bigwigs were not watching the black mecha's figure seriously, no one would have thought of switching the screen. For everyone in the hall, this black mecha that had disappeared alone should be the winner of this military exercise. All the soldiers in the command hall who were watching the battle were inexplicably nervous and confused. The black mecha seemed to be running like a headless fly. Did it hide a hidden meaning that no one could guess? This mystery was revealed when the black mecha stopped for the first time, and also when it stopped for the last time. The black mecha felt its way to the top of a mountain and then quietly squatted down, as if preparing for something. There was a camp below the valley. What is this place? Minister Zhou asked curiously. Although the military exercise command hall was very clear about the military deployment and losses of both sides, right now, everyone's eyes had followed the black mecha for so long that they were a little confused. Blue Pool Mountain. Peak number 2. It was still that military staff officer who was in charge of information gathering. He stood up from behind the workbench and said in a trembling voice, full of disbelief, Zhou Yingxing frowned and turned to look at him. That military staff officer licked his dry lips and said in a slightly hoarse voice, in the valley, is the blue team's command center. The black mecha had run all the way through the mountains without slowing down, and in the end it had actually bumped into the blue team's command center? At this time, of course, no one believed that this pilot had been a blind cat that had hit the mouse, a headless fly that had headed straight for the washroom, completely relying on luck. Everyone was shocked. A mecha that could not receive any signals on its own, how could it have found the blue team's command center? General Miles grunted in surprise and sat back down on the sofa. His white eyebrows raised slightly, and he seemed very satisfied. Minister Zhou's face was still calm, but he picked up the cup of tea on the coffee table and slowly took a few sips. The command hall could no longer keep quiet. Everyone began to talk in private, and the buzzing sound was accompanied by feelings of shock, filling the entire underground space. Du Xiaoqing looked at the screen in shock. Even he did not know where Shimin Jin would put the command center, so he had been calm before, but who would have thought that that guy would actually find it? His expression was cold, and 2 dark clouds appeared in his eyes. A major of the Iron 7th Division walked to his side and whispered a few words in his ear, then respectfully handed over the sunglasses. Du Xiaoqing took the sunglasses, but did not put them on. Instead, he coldly placed them on the coffee table beside him. The major hesitated. He wanted to say a few words of advice, but looking at the commander's already cold face in the end, he did not dare to say anything. Finding the command center does not mean you have the ability to break through the camp. Even I admire Shimin Jin's ability to set up camp. You only have one MX. I want to see how you can break through the camp and win. Du Xiaoqing looked at the black mecha resting on the peak of the mountain on the screen, and a fierce light flashed through his deep eyes. Right at this time, a soft cry came from the command hall. It was not that the black mecha had done something amazing again, but that the first ray of sunlight from planet S1 had finally broken through the horizon and spilled onto the ground. The black MX mecha that was quietly squatting on the peak of the Blue Lake Mountain just happened to welcome the freshest sunlight. In the dim light of dawn, the black mecha bathed to its heart's content, full of solemn beauty. This scene was truly beautiful. After Du Xiaoqing graduated with the highest score from the 1st Military Academy, he was assigned to the 3rd Military Region. Ignoring the military headquarters' request to cherish talent, he forcefully requested to enter the already fallen Iron 7th Division. In the Iron 7th Division, his first position was as the battalion commander of the Independent Battalion. The resurgence of the Iron 7th Division was also due to the victory of the Independent Battalion in a certain military exercise. Du Xiaoqing had been promoted from battalion commander to division commander. The 1st Independent Battalion he led was also reorganized into the local defense battalion that protected the division headquarters. What the black mecha Sulu was operating was facing was precisely this kind of super-mechanized battalion that had a glorious tradition and powerful combat strength. In the impromptu military exercise this morning, despite the efforts of Zhou Yu and the other officers, the 7th team had still been torn apart by the local defense camp. Su Lu, on the other hand, only had one MX mecha. Yet, he had to face the seemingly calm but definitely heavily guarded headquarters of the local defense camp. The morning light shone on the mountain peak, shining on the black mecha that was half-crouched like a statue. Iron 7th Division headquarters definitely didn't expect a mecha to be able to reach their headquarters in a completely shielded state. But their commander was Shimin Jin. Just as Division Commander Du Xiaoqing had praised, Shimin Jin was a very strict person. Even in this kind of highly modern simulation exercise, he still arranged for human sentries around the camp. The first person to discover the black MX mecha was a soldier on the western sentry post. Without any warning, a sharp alarm rang through the quiet valley. The small radius precision radar began to scan wildly, trying to determine the location of the enemy. Early in the morning was the best time to launch a sneak attack, but it definitely wasn't suitable for Iron 7th Division. The exercise had only started in the early morning, so all the officers and soldiers of this division still maintained a very clear mind and spirit. From the moment they had discovered the black MX mecha, it had only taken 3 seconds for the self-propelled cannons around the camp to aim at the peak of Blue Pond Peak under the guidance of the electronic system. With a violent roar, the cannons fired without hesitation. In an instant, the roar was so loud that the entire valley seemed to shake. Who knew how many self-firing cannons Shimin Jin had set up around the camp headquarters? These self-firing cannons were simple to equip and easy to set up. They didn't have much destructive power in the mountains, but once they were used to fire at fast targets on the slopes, they were extremely powerful. Could it be that Iron 7th Division had thought from the start that the mecha could break through the camp? Or could it be that this was an ambush? Sulu didn't think too much about it. From the moment he had appeared on the peak, he had entered battle mode. It was only natural that he would be discovered by the enemy, so he didn't panic. As for what kind of defensive measures Iron 7th Division had set up around the camp headquarters, it was none of his business. He was a simple and direct person. With an axe he would smash a future, and with a knife he would cleave a ray of light. Right now, with the MX mecha in hand, the strength in his body was surging. Other than rushing down, he had not prepared a second battle plan for himself at all. It was precisely because of this kind of absolute heroism that the black mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. Even if it wasn't a sneak attack, it was still a sneak attack. 3 seconds later, the self-firing cannons were all aimed at the top of the black mecha. From this, one could see how fast the mecha was. Sitting in the cockpit, Sulu stared at the holographic screen in front of him. His left eye was looking at the eye-catching row of citizen numbers in the valley camp. He felt the intense vibrations coming from the mecha, but his heart was unprecedentedly calm. Every time he entered the mecha, he would enter a very strange mental state. It was as if the mecha was the real world, while the outside world was completely isolated. There were only countless data models moving quickly there. His left hand pushed the control stick fiercely, his right hand quickly entering commands. The simulation system was at full power, the precision instruments magnifying and correcting every tiny movement of his body, then faithfully reproduced by the Black MX mecha. Silently and sternly, the mecha charged down the mountain peak. The Black mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. There was no longer any sense of lightness, only an unstoppable momentum. With every step the heavy alloy mecha took, a few pieces of rock burst out. It was as if the entire mountain peak was trembling. The huge recoil force was absorbed by the mecha's highly efficient connecting devices and spherical joints, turning into a forward momentum. Thus, with every step the Black mecha took, its speed increased by a few notches. Under the mecha's feet, the mountain rocks cracked, like a yellow dragon in the morning light. At the end of the yellow dragon, the Black MX mecha's body was unusually cold. Its speed increased, to the point where the mecha's movement frequency could not be seen clearly. "What is he trying to do?" asked General Miles, frowning in the command hall. "Speed up?" said Zhou Yingxing uncertainly, his brow also tightly furrowed. "He's going to fall to his death if he speeds up any more," said General Miles silently. With the current slope of Blue Pool Mountain, if the Black mecha continued to speed up like this, there was no need for Iron 7th Division's concentrated artillery fire at all. He would fall to his death. However, he believed that the young man his old teacher had chosen would give him another surprise like before, so he did not say this out loud. Shimanjin did not think that the Black mecha charging down from the monitor would fall to his death, because even after being attacked, he still maintained the absolute calm of a commander. The other party had gone through untold hardships to find their way to his camp, definitely not to commit suicide, so he decided to send the other party on his way. Today's military exercise, the battle in the Lonely Mountains and Yellow Mountain Ridge, had been decided. Although the resistance of the officers and cadets was unexpectedly fierce, making it difficult for him to deal with, in the end they had won. As long as they destroyed this Black mecha, which could be either amazing or stupid, the Iron 7th Division would welcome another victory. "Fire from all directions," Shimanjin calmly gave the order. He picked up his cup of coffee and took a sip, allowing the staff officer beside him to operate the electronic workstation. He had carefully studied all of the technical parameters of the MX mecha, so he was very clear about the terrifying movement speed and close-range combat ability of this new mecha. Thus, he was very certain that under his long-prepared all-around attack this time, that Black mecha would definitely be hit continuously. The first round of concentrated fire from the howitzers did not even graze the side of the Black mecha. It was as comical as setting off a round of fireworks to cheer on the Black mecha's heroic attack. But inside the mecha, Sulu was abnormally calm. The Iron 7th Division, who had won 37 consecutive military exercises, would not be flustered by his sneak attack, even though the person personally in command this time was not that cold and ruthless division commander do as expected. The reactivated MX's onboard radar and SCC search system suddenly emitted a shrill warning. Trembling violently, Sulu stared at the screen and narrowed his eyes. Looking at the complex lines on the screen that represented lethality, Sulu really could not understand. Chapter 340. Not the past, not the old teacher. General Miles stood up abruptly and looked at the Black mech on the screen with great emotion. After a while he came back to his senses. Many years had passed since those days of war on the Empire's planet fields. The Black mech trembled under the bombardment of grenades on the steep slopes of the Blue Pool Peak. It used its demonic high-speed body movements to avoid damage, and continued to accelerate forward with a chill. Compared to the old teacher with the surname Li, it was obvious that there was still a huge gap. He operated an MX, while the old teacher operated an M37. However, he still had not reached the level of the old teacher where he could break through obstacles alone and make the rivers give way to him. However, the two mechs that were separated by decades, whether it was the control method or the traces of movement, there were some similarities. General Miles looked at this scene and thought that he understood the real reason why the old teacher protected Sulu so much. He couldn't help but be speechless. In reality, it only took a very short time to dodge through 17 complicated and difficult areas at high speed. The people watching the military exercise only felt that their eyes were blurred for a few seconds. The black mech instantly escaped the range of the grenades and broke through the smoke and dust in the valley. Like a god of death from the netherworld, it continued to rush down the mountain. Whether it was the initial sniper attack or the difficult process of avoiding the grenade firing line after that, the black mech did not slow down at all. Even every indeterminate turn and slide was completed at high speed. Seeing the speed at which the black mecha was falling towards the valley was getting faster and faster, about to become a stream of flowing black light, the spectators, who had already been shocked by the pilot's superb control skills, could not help but feel a chill run down their spines. If the speed limit was exceeded and the onboard system lost control, would this black mecha fall to pieces? They should have guessed that this pilot would be like before, and would definitely be hiding many surprises. However, seeing this kind of high-speed crazy impact that was close to losing control with their own eyes, the people were still very worried. Being hit head-on by the crazy black MX mech, the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division in the valley was still calm. The invisible electric waves in the air flowed quickly. All the soldiers coldly and calmly continued with the work at hand, as if they did not see this scene. Along with the clear sound of motors, the level-firing grenade base completed its second round of automatic aiming in the shortest amount of time. Following the officer's order, the electrically controlled anti-infantry mines buried in front of the steep slope of Blue Pool Mountain exploded one after another, sending countless earth pillars into the air. Like countless fireworks, they blocked the path of the black mecha. This type of weapon, which was extremely destructive against individual soldiers and even armored vehicles, might not be able to do much damage to the sturdy MX mecha, but it could successfully interfere with the field's vision, buying the best opportunity and space for the level-firing grenade launchers. The sky full of grenades rained down again. At this time, the black mecha had already charged up 3/5 of the steep slope. Its own speed had already been raised to a terrifying level. Under such high inertia, no matter how skilled the pilot was, he would not be able to make those inconceivable dodging movements in the face of this sky full of grenades. The fire control of the Iron 7th Division's defense battalion was so precise that it was praiseworthy. They didn't panic because of the enemy's strength, and didn't hesitate because of the failure of the first wave of attacks. They quickly launched the second wave of attacks without pause, and the details were calculated very precisely. At this moment, even if the uncle was reborn, or the old man came out of seclusion, they probably would not be able to dodge such a dense barrage of attacks at such a short distance. Sulu naturally would not be able to do so either. However, just as the defense battalion was firing at full power, a strange change suddenly occurred to the black mech. Amidst the rumbling of the bullets, countless crisp sounds could be clearly heard. Those were the sounds of metal colliding with metal and separating from each other. The modified main cannon on the right shoulder of the black MX mecha instantly spat out flames. Although it did not carry actual ammunition, this kind of momentum was still shocking. Even as it was falling at a high speed, to the point of almost losing its momentum, the main cannon of the black mecha still managed to successfully deal a great deal of damage to the close-range fire control formation of the local defense camp. However, the people in the command center did not have time to assess the casualties of the local defense camp. Instead, they found that the black mecha's main cannon had flown up after this round of furious fire. Like a piece of scrap metal, it whistled through the air and shot towards the group of level-firing grenades. Main cannon detached automatically. The staff officers in the command hall could no longer maintain their calm mechanical voices. They reported loudly in shock. Long-range weapon system detached automatically. Platform-type cover strip detached. Hidden repair arm detached. Area 41's firmware detached. Auxiliary balancer ejected. The military staff officer's voice was urgent and shocked. However, on the steep slope in front of the command center, everything that was happening to the black mecha was happening much faster than his explanation. Following the crisp sound of metal clashing and detaching, Countless heavy components were ejected from the black mecha's body. In the original design, this type of detachment had a certain initial velocity to prevent damage to the mecha itself. However, at this time, the black mecha was already descending at an almost uncontrollable speed. At the same time, the heavy components that were detached from the mecha's body were also moving at a terrifying speed. They were actually sputtering outwards without stopping. Some of the firmware was ejected into the air at high speed. Others were ejected in front of the black mecha. As the black mecha continued to descend, components were sputtering out of the mecha's body. This scene was extremely strange. It was like a solid black boulder that could not withstand the erosion of thousands of years. It fell from the mountain peak, colliding with each other and sending countless fragments flying everywhere. These splashing components were extremely fast, their mass massive, and they were immensely powerful. They battered the entire hillside into a sorry state, and for some strange reason, they even helped the black mecha block several level fire grenades that were aimed at its hard body. Was this luck or something else? Mecha battle damage. 23%. The military staff officer in the command center stared dumbfoundedly at the image on the screen. He pulled up the data and confirmed that the black mecha had still survived the second round of Iron 7 Division's normal shooting. What was even more frightening was that, after this extremely dramatic visual impact of the components peeling off and sputtering, the black mecha, which was already moving at an extremely fast speed, seemed to have instantly increased its speed by several notches. The steep peak of MT Blue Cake, which was over 1,000 meters long, was actually about to touch the bottom. "Enter overclocking mode," he shouted loudly. There were many people in the command center who had watched Ka Chifeng's battle before. When they saw the black mecha's components being detached, they had already guessed that the black mecha was preparing to enter overclocking mode. What shocked them was the way the black mecha had entered overclocking mode. General Miles narrowed his eyes at the screen. Forcefully entering an overclocking state at such a high speed. Yet the high-speed sputtering of components did not cause any problems with the balance of the MX mecha itself. Could it be that Su Li's level of mecha control had already reached this level? When the black mecha appeared on the mountain peak, Du Xiaoqing's expression was only occasionally gloomy, but it was immediately back to normal. When the black mecha rushed down towards the camp in a valiant manner, he was still sitting on the sofa, his expression as cold as ever. His sunglasses still by his side, unmoving. But when he saw the black mecha enter overclocking mode in such a manner, his fingers on the sofa's armrest finally moved. The major beside him glanced at him, but in the end did not hand over the sunglasses. After the shock of the command center, there was silence. Everyone looked at the screen in confusion. Even if it had entered overclocking mode, the black mecha was about to turn into a stream of light and smash into the ground. What was that pilot going to do? On the peak of Ka Chifeng, the purple CMX controlled by Madman Li could not even last 3 minutes of overclocking mode. The Nutshell Standard MX, which used Little White Flower as its prototype, did not have that kind of fatal flaw. However, overclocking was still an overload on the mecha system. Be it the designer or the user, no one would expect to be able to maintain such a crazy and dangerous state forever. Su Lu was both the designer and the user. Naturally, he knew this better than anyone else. He did not know how well the Iron 7th Division's defense battalion was arranged, but he definitely would not underestimate the Iron Blood Army and Shiman Jin, who had single-handedly created by Du Xiaoqing. Therefore, he needed to keep the overclocking mode for as long as possible until the most critical moment of the breakout. It was precisely because of this reason that he had always used the conventional mode when he sneaked between the mountains before dawn. Even when he initiated the charge, he still did so. It was not until the last moment when he was forced into a desperate situation by the defensive firepower of the Iron 7th Division that he took off his clothes and threw away his sweaty clothes. Like a newborn bird returning to the forest, like a maiden returning to her first love on the beach, he rushed towards the camp in the valley. Removing the heavy components from the sputtering walls helped him deal with a portion of the dense grenades. This could be said to be luck, but it could also be said to be Su Li's precise control of instantaneous battle situations. Of course, there was also a lot of shamelessness mixed in. After all, this was a drill. When the grenades hit those components, they would only crash to the ground. If this was a real battle, who knew how many explosions would have occurred in front of him? How could the battle damage be maintained within 30%? What should he do next? Looking at the hard ground approaching at high speed on the screen before him, feeling the violent tremors of the MX mecha as if it was about to fall apart under the high speed, Su Li's eyes behind the goggle-like screen narrowed and shone brightly. His exposed lips pursed tightly, and even his barely budding beard blossomed with a certain fierceness. In that split second he pressed the red button beside the control stick. With a low grunt, he channeled all the power in his body into his muscles and skin, using the simulation system to control the central system of the mecha. In an instant, the falling black mecha was forcefully pulled back up from the ground. No one could defy the laws of nature, so when the people in the command hall saw the black mecha crash into the ground like a blind tiger, they all thought that the black mecha would not survive. In order to pass through the layers of defensive firepower of the Iron 7th Division, the black mecha had no choice but to engage in a high-speed charge. However, in the end, it seemed that the black mecha would also be destroyed by the high-speed charge. The generals and officers did not close their eyes because they could not bear to watch. They only frowned, very worried about the safety of the pilot. Just a few flashes of lightning and thunder from before had already made them feel a strong sense of respect for the pilot. There were only about 3 people in the hall who still had confidence in the black mecha. General Miles and Minister Zhou looked at the screen calmly. Their confidence came from the attitude of the old man in Philadelphia and Su Li's previous performance. However, the third person was a little strange because it was Du Xiaoqing. Du Xiaoqing looked coldly at the screen. He definitely did not believe that the black mecha would be stupid enough to commit suicide. Just as he expected, in the next moment, the entire command hall suddenly fell into a collective silence. Everyone looked at the black mecha on the screen, shocked, speechless, as if it had turned into a fossil. At this moment, the image on the screen seemed to have been muted. The scene in the valley camp also seemed to have been muted. There was only a deathly silence. The dense cluster of flaming grenade cannons tried to lift their barrels in vain. The anti-infantry mines that were still exploding seemed to have disappeared as well. Only small mushrooms rose from the steep slope and then dissipated into a sandstorm cloud. In the dead silence, the soldiers of Iron 7 Division, who were as calm as machine parts, finally couldn't help but reveal shocked expressions. Like the spectating officers in the command hall, they raised their heads and looked at the silent picture without any reaction. In the greenish-yellow sandstorm cloud, the silvery-white streamlined wings attached to the waist of the black mecha that was charging down at high speed had already spread out. The black mecha had already left the ground, whistling through the sand and the rain of bullets, and was sprinting towards the camp. This moment it really flew. Mecha could not fly, and neither could the MX. However, at high speeds, with the help of its perfectly designed wings, it could glide through the air. This was originally designed to be used to forcibly drop mecha into the air, but today the black mecha that Su Li was piloting had shown another use for it. In Ka Chifeng's shocking battle, because of the vacuum of the Old Moon polar region, the wings attached to the 2 MX mechas had only played a part of the role of balance. Today's charge, if not for the terrain to forcibly increase the mecha's speed to the maximum, how could it have been able to glide through the air in such a beautiful curve? The unexpected had to be obtained from the unexpected. Countless people watched as the black mecha soared into the air like a giant black bird, passing through the control fire of the local defense camp. They could not help but be shocked, speechless. This scene would be branded in everyone's minds for a long time. In reality, the black mecha had only stayed in the air for 2 seconds, but it had already forcibly passed through the most concentrated line of fire of the local defense camp to land in the middle of the camp. With a loud boom, the black mecha's alloy mechanical feet landed heavily on the ground. Shards of metal and dirt flew everywhere, and the Iron 7 Division soldiers who were yelling at the top of their lungs fell down in all directions. But what no one expected was that after the black mecha had passed through the control fire of the local defense camp, it did not directly enter the location of the command center. Instead, before landing, it forcibly twisted its body 30 degrees to the west, aiming for an ordinary barracks at the entrance of Blue Cake Mountain. At this moment, the deathly still scene seemed to have a sound once again. The sound of guns, electronic screams, and the sound of the self-propelled artillery system's motors rang out densely. But the MX mecha had already passed through the middle of the camp. How could these control fire of the local defense camp keep up with its ghostly footsteps? Under normal conditions, the Black MX was already able to avoid long-range attacks. Now that it was in overclocking mode, its trembling body, strange twisting movements, and dazzling fast-dodging movements allowed the Black MX to successfully avoid most of the interception and rush towards its target. In the cockpit, Su Li's face was pale. Cold sweat flowed down his face. The heat in his body was quickly draining away. After controlling the MX to perform so many perverted movements, his energy and physical strength had already reached the limit. Most importantly, the damned hunger in his stomach had come to disturb him again. Without hesitation, he controlled the MX to charge towards that ordinary barracks at the fastest speed possible. This was because he knew that Shimin-jin was in that ordinary barracks. The room on the right that seemed to be the command center was in fact empty. Shimin-jin was indeed very careful. Even though the Iron 7th Division had clearly obtained an overwhelming victory, he still made so many strict arrangements in the camp headquarters. That alone was not enough. He had even disguised the command center. This kind of commander was really scary. So when the onboard radar alarm sounded and 4M52 mecha suddenly appeared in front of the ordinary barracks, Su Lu was not at all surprised. Shimin-jin had only used 2/3 of his military strength to forcefully suppress the officers and cadets in the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge area. The rest of his forces were all placed in the command center. Moreover, these 4M52 mecha that had been hidden for a long time had been warmed up since the start of the drill, silently guarding this area. This was not a trap set up by Iron 7th Division. This was the meticulous design and strict tactical discipline of the Iron 7th Division that they had learned from Du Shaoqing. A dignified division would not fight an unprepared war. They had to be prepared to the fullest. This way, once the situation changed, any backup plan of the Iron 7th Division could become a trap that could kill the enemy. But so what if it was a trap? Facing the 4M52 mecha that had their camouflage cloth removed, the heavy mechanical legs of the Black MX quickly moved on the ground, turning into a series of afterimages. It avoided the hail of bullets at an unimaginable speed, and closed in on the bodies of the 2M52 mecha. The Black MX's right alloy fist smashed heavily into the central system of one of the M52 mecha, easily breaking through the sturdy alloy armor. At the same time, its left alloy hand reached out like lightning to fiercely control the right arm of the other M52 that was spraying bullets. The huge difference in power output made the M52 mecha that the military had always been proud of look like a drunkard in front of the Black MX. Moreover, it was completely unable to break free from the Black MX's control. The Carlin barrels of the 2M52 mecha were still rotating at high speed, spraying bullets. However, they were unable to hit the Black MX between them. Instead, they aimed at each other's chests and abdomens. Two beautiful streaks of bullet fire splashed into the mecha like electric sparks, instantly destroying each other. Meanwhile, the Black MX controlled by Su Lu pushed up with both arms, shaking off the 2M52 mecha that had already stopped moving, and with a whoosh it dove in. It had to be admitted that Su Li's breakout had ultimately taken advantage of many military exercises. If both sides had used live ammunition, in that shocking scene earlier, the 2M52 mecha would have been forced to shoot at each other. At such a close distance, the high-speed spray of armor-piercing bullets would definitely have hurt the Black MX mecha. The Federation's military exercise combat system was extremely accurate. Once the central control computer confirmed that a mecha had been killed, it would immediately stop working, including the soldiers. After the Black MX had swiftly and valiantly killed the 2M5 mecha, it then charged towards the normal barracks. At this moment, the Black mecha was like a special forces soldier engaging in close combat, fiercely throwing 14 punches at the remaining 2M5 mecha. Based on Su Li's understanding of mecha structures, these heavy blows were definitely enough to ensure that these two mecha would never have the chance to stand up again. Suddenly, the Black mecha's right mechanical arm reached out, and as quick as lightning, it grabbed one of the already stopped M52 mecha and threw it viciously to the right. The Black MX mecha was about the same weight as the M-series mecha, but after stripping off the components and entering an overclocked state, its body appeared much slimmer in comparison. However, with its powerful twin engines outputting 4 times the power output, it was actually able to easily grab the M52 mecha and throw it. This scene was very strange. It was as if a delicate woman with a frosty expression had picked up a burly man and thrown him away like a sandbag. Of course, the Black Mecha had not done this to vent, but to humiliate the Iron 7th Division. The M52 mecha it had thrown accurately hit a self-propelled heavy cannon 50 meters to the right. That modified self-propelled heavy cannon did not even have time to blast out the electromagnetic beam bomb that mecha feared the most before it was smashed all over the ground by this ruined mecha that had been thrown over. The graphite beams that shot out were extremely magnetic as they stuck to the ruined mecha and began to flash with blue electric arcs. This pitiful mecha that had been used as a sandbag twitched uncontrollably. The Black Mecha shuddered as it moved at high speed, clearing out all the targets in its path one by one. It twisted its body forcefully in midair, using an extremely beautiful pose to transform into a phantom, nimbly dodging the 4 incoming rocket projectiles by a hair's breadth. Speed. What it needed was speed. The Black Mecha pushed its speed to the limit. Whether it was the 4 hidden mechas, the electromagnetic beam bomb, or the individual rocket projectiles that were impossible to defend against, none of them could stop the Black Mecha's footsteps for even a moment. Before the remaining armored soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could surround it, the Black Mecha had already inconceivably crossed 70 meters in a second. With one foot, it overturned an electronically linked armored vehicle. With a shake of its body, it rushed to the front of the ordinary barrack and smashed open the door with a punch. In the barrack, the officers and staff of the Iron 7th Division looked at the Black Mecha outside the door, their expressions extremely ugly. The Black Mecha was like a skilled assassin that could kill with a single strike. It didn't give them much time to react. Shimin-Jin, whose hair was a little dry, turned around and glanced at the Black Mecha. She was about to say something. However, the pilot in the Black Mecha did not have the demeanor of an assassin. Before Shimin-Jin could speak, the pilot in the Black Mecha lifted its heavy mechanical arm and completed the last designated action through the control system. Under the burning gazes of the officers of the Iron 7th Division, the Black Mecha's right alloy arm pointed directly at the highest commander here, Shimin-Jin. Chapter 341. The Black MX Mecha had already stripped away all of its long-range firepower systems. Right now, facing the gloomy Iron 7th Division officers from outside the barracks, if it wanted to complete its tactical objective, it could only rely on the mecha's movements. In other words, Shimin-Jin could only be trampled to death, beaten to death, and tortured to death by the Black Mecha. Sulu didn't want to humiliate the opponent, but this was the only way he could fight. Of course, he couldn't really break through the door and use his heavy mechanical legs to trample Shimin-Jin into minced meat. He could only enter the next step into the battle damage system in the Military Exercise Command Center. Through precise calculations, the command center directly determined that his actions were effective. In the next moment, the Military Exercise Command Center and the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division all received a notification from the battle damage system. The blue team commander has died. The officers and generals in the command center couldn't hide their shock as they watched the image on the screen. The Black Mech rushed down from the top of Blue Pond Peak. The smoke and cannons exploded. In just a few moments, this MX had already successfully broken through the barracks, completing this mission that seemed impossible to complete in the first place. General Miles's white eyebrows bloomed as he sighed softly in relief. The Minister of Defense, Zhou calmly picked up the cup of tea beside him and took a sip. The tea was already cold, but he didn't react at all. It seemed that this military big shot was hiding a lot of emotions under his calm exterior. Then, everyone's eyes turned to the right side of the command center. The Federal Army officers were very curious. What kind of expression would the usually cold and arrogant division commander Du Shaoqing have after witnessing the defeat of his own troops? To their surprise and slight disappointment, although Division Commander Du Shaoqing had already stood up, his expression was still cold, his posture dignified, and his figure straight. He didn't seem to have suffered such a heavy blow at all. Of course, some people still noticed that Division Commander Du's hands were clenched tightly behind his back. His knuckles were faintly white. The soldiers in the military drill hall were shocked by the performance of the black mecha, marveling at the unimaginable level of control displayed by the pilot. Du Xiaoqing was the same. Other than anger and gloom in his heart, he also felt a strong sense of incomprehension. As an all-rounder in military affairs, Division Commander Du Xiaoqing's mecha piloting skills were also quite outstanding. However, after seeing Sulu operate the Black MX with his own eyes, he could not use a logical deduction to convince himself that this was something a normal person could do. Du Xiaoqing's face was cold and detached as he looked at the black mecha and his subordinates on the screen. His brows furrowed. Those straight eyebrows that had always been like unsheathed swords seemed to have been resheathed at this moment. They became silent, as if they were waiting for something to happen. A moment later, another exclamation rang out in the military exercise command hall. The military staff officer who had completely lost his cool today stood up from behind the workbench and loudly reported, "Mecha damage 61%, 88%, 100%, the Black MX has exploded." The military exercise command hall suddenly fell into a state of busy calculations and shocked discussions. The staff officers could not understand why the Black MX had suddenly exploded after successfully breaking through the camp. The armored squad of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion had not yet arrived. What exactly happened in the command center? General Miles, who was sitting on the sofa, was stunned. He frowned and immediately thought of the part of the battle force that the Iron 7th Division had not used during this impromptu military exercise. After a moment of silence, a look of appreciation appeared on his face. Du Xiaoqing looked at the screen expressionlessly. That pair of eyebrows of his raised again. Although it was not as insufferably arrogant and unstoppable as before, it had recovered some of its luster. From the beginning of the military exercise until now, the Defense Battalion under the command of Shimin Jin had not used that fixed-speed non-cruise missile unit. He believed that his soldiers would not disappoint him to the extreme. The unforeseen event happened too quickly. The command system had just reported the news of the blue team's commander's death, when a sharp alarm rang out from the central control system of the mecha. Looking at the red energy lines blotting out the sky and covering the earth on the full-view radar screen, Sulu could not help but sweat profusely, drenching his back in the stuffy cockpit, even though he knew that this was all virtual. Different from the level-fire howitzers from before, a dense cluster of missiles flew in from an unknown base and covered the entire area around the barracks. It did not distinguish between friend and foe and carried out a powerful attack. The power of the missiles was set to explode, and on the virtual screen, the entire barracks turned into a sea of fire. Almost at the same time as the command hall, the battle damage system connected to the black mecha coldly and mechanically reported the battle damage situation. In just the blink of an eye, the Black MX, which had not yet lost 30% of its battle force, had its red column representing the status of the mecha drop continuously as if it was rapidly losing blood. In the end, the system determined that the mecha had exploded. During this process, the black mecha had no time to react at all. Faced with the high-speed missiles that blotted out the sky and covered the earth, even if it could react, it would not be able to complete any evasive maneuvers. It could only watch as its body was buried in the sea of fire. A deathly silence. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he stared intently at the data feedback on the screen. Listening to the cold voice of the system, he pondered in silence for a long time before he finally understood the source of all this. A fixed-velocity non-cruise missile unit. The military exercise command system had added a group of virtual soldiers for both sides of the exercise, and what had been added to the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was this two-base missile unit. During the exercise that had started before dawn, the Iron 7th Division had not used this unit at all. They had actually been suppressing it all this time until the very end, when they finally aimed at their own command center and launched a barrage of attacks without distinguishing friend from foe. This virtual unit was equipped with the Stinger 2 missile, which had terrifying absolute speed. However, it also had an extremely fatal flaw. The direct injection vortex engine made it impossible for this type of fast missile to perform precise navigation. Therefore, using this type of light missile to attack the powerful MX mecha from a distance would be very difficult to achieve any results. However, Shimanjin had placed the missile base in the valley behind Blue Pool Mountain and aimed it at her own command center. This excellent and meticulous commander had maintained absolute self-control and calm throughout the entire exercise, saving this force for the very end. Even when Su Li's black mecha had charged down from the mountain peak, due to the flaw of the Stinger 2 missile, the black mecha had still not been willing to fire recklessly. Only when the black mecha had penetrated deep into camp headquarters and was within the absolute range of the missile cluster did Shimanjin launch a devastating attack. At such a close distance, with such a high density of continuous fire, the Stinger 2 missile did not need a cruise system at all to blast any enemy into pieces. If the black mecha had been in the valley at this time, it would probably have been able to rely on its mobility to dodge this wave of attacks. However, at this time, the black mecha had succeeded in its mission and was no longer vigilant. Most importantly, this wave of missiles had been coldly aimed at its location. How could it escape? Inside the glowing red cockpit, Sulu pondered in silence for a very long time before he finally managed to sort out the sequence of events. Using the Stinger 2 missile against a mecha, only Shimanjin's method could achieve tactical results. However, what made him feel even colder was that the Iron 7th Division had actually buried the entire command center with it, wanting to bury him here. This kind of design was a little too cruel. He rubbed his stiff face, shook his head, and pressed the button to open the cockpit, accompanied by the sound of hydraulic systems and motors. The cockpit of the black mecha at the entrance to the command center of the Iron 7th Division's defense camp slowly opened. At this time, the military exercise command system had already determined that all personnel near the command center were dead, so the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could only stare at the open cockpit door with ugly expressions. They did not raise their weapons to aim at the enemy. Although this black mecha had exploded and died in the end, the other party had broken into their camp and killed 4 of their own mecha in an instant. In the end, they had even killed their highest commanding officer. This was the equivalent of a tight slap to their faces. The pale-faced Sulu crawled out of the cockpit, but he did not climb down to the ground. Instead, he stood on the alloy railings and looked down at the angry Iron 7th Division officers with narrowed eyes. Although he had been determined to be dead in the end, he had done everything he could. He had successfully broken into camp and killed the enemy's commander, so there was a hint of youthful excitement in his calm mood. There was no regret or sadness. "You're really ruthless." Sulu felt unusually tired. He wiped the sweat off his forehead with his fingers and sat down on the slightly hot mecha. Leaning against the tough alloy armor, he looked down at the gloomy commander in the barracks and said seriously, "I admit that Iron 7th Division has the right to be proud." These were sincere words. In today's impromptu military exercise, Zhou Yu's group of officers who were born in the Lonely Mountain and Yellow Mountain Ridge area had displayed their strongest abilities. Otherwise, they would not have been able to delay the large number of soldiers of the defense camp for so long and give Sulu a chance to break into camp. However, in the face of Iron 7th Division's well-trained and unusually calm offensive, the red team could only lose. What was even more frightening was that Sulu had cheated and had the ability to operate a mecha that few people in this world understood. He had displayed the performance of the Black MX to the extreme and unexpectedly broke into the camp. In the end, he had encountered 3 layers of backup from Iron 7th Division. Although he had succeeded in killing the enemy's commander in the end, he had also ushered in death. Shimanjin sat in the barracks with a calm expression. He did not pick up the coffee cup in his hand again. His mood was not as calm as his expression. He had long been boiling with anger. He had commanded the most powerful defense camp of Iron 7th Division, but he had actually been broken in by a single Black MX. The commander had been killed? What kind of humiliation was this? He did not raise his head to speak to Sulu on the black mecha because that would make people feel that Sulu was looking down at him with the attitude of a victor. Chapter 342. The battle at the front line of Lonely Ridge had just ended a minute ago. The military exercise command system had used the fastest speed to determine the outcome. Although the red team had successfully killed the blue team's commander, the red team's final members had all been killed. The blue team had completed the final tactical mission, so the system determined the blue team's victory. Hearing the notification of victory, Shimin-jin's expression became more and more unsightly. How could this kind of victory taste good? I never thought of using the sharp stinger type 2. In the valley I was just being cautious out of habit. However, I really didn't think that your side would actually have a mecha that could break into my command center. Just when the camp command center was deathly silent, Shimin-jin suddenly opened her mouth and said, "But there is one thing that I don't understand no matter how I think about it. To pass through my electronic detection, your mecha must have entered the automatic electronic shield. Then how were you able to find my camp?" This commander finally raised his head and looked at the exhausted Sulu sitting on the mecha. He asked, "Not only did you find the camp, you even guessed that this room was the real command center. How did you do it?" Shimin-jin used a philosophical tone, frowning as he supported himself on the table, and asked the question that had puzzled him for a long time. The humiliation of being successfully broken into by the opponent had magnified the questions and shock in his heart by countless times. Thus, he would rather raise his head and look at the high and mighty Sulu and ask aloud. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division around the Blue Pool Valley gradually gathered. There were about 150 of them, and all of them had already been determined to be dead by the command system. The soldiers looked at the black mecha disguised as the entrance of the command center. They looked at the young pilot leaning against the body of the mecha. Their faces were ashen, and the hostility in their gazes was almost enough to cause some kind of substantial harm. Sulu was Donglin's stone. He would never be affected by the emotions of his enemies. He would not be moved by external things. His face was like a hard stone covering the outside of a stone, blocking out all these gazes. After a moment of silence, he looked at Shimin-jin below the mecha and said, "Yesterday, when Instructor Du was lecturing the officer students, he said that soldiers should have a gambling spirit. I just took a gamble. Looks like my luck is not bad and I won the gamble." Shimin-jin looked at him with gloomy expression and said, "Who will believe these words?" Sulu was speechless. He thought to himself that he couldn't possibly dance around on the mecha and then sing in a hoarse voice, "This is a little secret, I won't tell you, I'll tell you." Looking at Du Shaoqing's cold style, Shimin-jin, who was sitting firmly in the camp and was still trying her best to imitate Du Shaoqing's cold style even though she had died miserably, Sulu looked at the string of pale yellow radiance on the head of this outstanding commander and wanted to tell the other party, "Not only do I know where your headquarters is, I even know that you are a citizen of Donglin, and you are 35 years old this year." However, looking at Shimin-jin's bloodshot eyes and dry and unnatural hair, Sulu didn't say anything in the end as he thought of the other party's current mood. He maintained his composure under the hateful gazes of the Iron 7th Division soldiers surrounding him and didn't appear to be too happy. At noon, the troops participating in the military exercise finally retreated one by one. Although it was only a small impromptu military exercise, a battle on the scale of 1,000 people, transporting the damaged equipment back was already quite troublesome. What was even more troublesome was that the soldiers who had been injured by the flying debris during the Black Mecha's breakout needed to be treated in time. Fortunately, there were no real fatalities. Even so, although the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who had retreated were as silent and calm as usual, anyone could find a different emotion in their eyes: unwillingness and intense anger. This anger was not directed at the Red Team officer students in the exercise, but rather at this unexpected outcome. This embarrassing victory. What kind of army was the Iron 7th Division? The brotherly troops who had suffered a dismal ending in 37 military exercises knew best. They were as solemn as winter to the enemy, and as harsh as the harshest of art connoisseurs who refused to accept red packets from cultural foundations. They were extremely strict in their management, and on the battlefield they cruelly demanded that there be no loopholes. The problem was that in this impromptu military exercise, they didn't think that they had done anything wrong, but they still lost, so they were angry. At the same time, they also had countless complex emotions towards the pilot who had piloted the Black Mecha. There was hatred, confusion, shock, and all kinds of emotions mixed together, but they still returned to the original point: anger. On the military airport, heavy transport aircraft were taking off and landing non-stop. Heavy transport helicopters whizzed past like large birds. Further away, transport spaceships were on standby. Soldiers with orderly footsteps walked across the road with stern expressions. The entire base was filled with a busy and solemn atmosphere. Shimin Jean, whose dry black hair was messy in the wind, led the staff officers of the defense battalion and walked at the front of the line. Her expression was very ugly, and even when she walked into the warehouse of the base, the expression on her face didn't change at all. Unlike the anger of the Iron 7th Division, the military officers who were in line couldn't hide the smile on their faces. All of them who had represented the Red Team had died or been captured, and they had just been released by the main force of the Iron 7th Division. Everyone should have been dejected, with a face full of grief and indignation, doing their duty as a loser, but they just smiled and looked outside the warehouse. In this military exercise, the performance of the military officers was actually very outstanding. Relying on the 7MXs and the virtual forces transferred by the central computer, they actually managed to hold the main force of the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division at the front line of the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge for more than an hour. This bought precious time and opportunity for Su Lu to break through the camp. But after being scolded like a snowstorm by Du Xiaoqing yesterday afternoon, they couldn't be proud of this kind of thing. The reason for their pride was the black MX that was slowly being lowered by the heavy helicopter outside the warehouse. Su Lu, wearing a black high-energy material pilot suit, rubbed his sweaty hair, dragged the heavy black workbench box, and walked at the back of the line into the warehouse where the participating soldiers were lined up. The moment he appeared in front of everyone, Zhou Yu, who had a gentle smile on his face, and Hua Xiaoxi, whose left shoulder was injured, were the first to start clapping. Although close to 1,000 Iron 7 Division officers and men were looking ahead without any movement, the 30-odd trainees, 17 men from Team 7, and the staff officers in the base were applauding fervently. It was as if there was a thunderstorm, as if there was a clap of thunder in spring. Su Lu was slightly taken aback, but then he narrowed his eyes and smiled. He raised his hand and waved in the direction of the trainees. Then he heard the sharp whistles and cheers of the 7th Division. Hearing the applause, whistles and cheers, the expressions of the Iron 7th Division soldiers, who had been cold and calm, became even more gloomy. Listening to the applause, Su Lu thought back to the day when the MX Mecha had been successfully developed in the underground storeroom of the Nutshell Engineering Department in the Harbor City Industrial Park. When he and Shang Qiu had walked into the quiet storeroom, what had greeted them had also been such a moving applause. Suddenly he had the urge to call Shang Qiu and tell her about this scene. The biggest difference between glory and vanity was whether or not you had done the right thing for this sense of glory. If the glory Su Lu enjoyed after the military exercise was vanity, he wouldn't reject it. He would only enjoy it, and he would be willing to enjoy it monotonously and repeatedly. Minister Zhou and General Myers didn't participate in the inspection after the military exercise. The two most powerful big shots in the military had to leave some face for the Iron 7th Division. After all, the final victor of the military exercise was the Iron 7th Division. If they were there, they would have to be kind to Su Lu and protect him. Where would the dignity of the Iron 7th Division go? In addition, these two big shots probably also thought that Su Lu was already in a pot of oil right now, so there was no need to give him too much face and splash a ladle of alcohol on him. What ended the thunderous applause in the warehouse was another round of monotonous and dull applause. The commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Xiaoqing, had a calm expression on his face. He looked at Su Lu, who walked in with a box, and clapped lightly with his hands that were wearing lambskin gloves. The applause was somewhat dull, so the applause in the warehouse quietened down. Complete silence. Su Lu walked to the front of the formation and gave a military salute. The reception after the military exercise ended very quickly. The federal military needed this exercise to change the inherent tactical thinking of many of the generals. But in reality, if one carefully analyzed these two exercises, the Iron 7th Division led by Du Xiaoqing was actually the unit that didn't need to be hammered the least. The nimble and precise tactical design allowed the Iron 7th Division to seamlessly coordinate with the MX Mecha's powerful attacks. The soldiers in the warehouse gradually dispersed. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division gathered together, and the officers and men of the Iron 7th Division naturally gathered together. Lan Xiaolong glanced at Shimanjin, who walked past him, and said, "I'm really sorry we lost again. But please believe me, we didn't go easy on you." In order to cover for Su Li's Black MX mecha going deep into the mountains, the Iron 7th Division had no choice but to expose themselves. All of them were surrounded. Lan Xiaolong was pitifully captured, but in front of the Iron 7th Division, he didn't feel like a captive at all. Nearly 1,000 Iron 7th Division soldiers heard these provocative words, and their expressions turned ugly. But in the end, they couldn't stage a gang fight in front of so many high-ranking military officials in the warehouse. Even Shimanjin only paused for a moment before leaving the scene. Zhou Yu patted Lan Xiaolong's shoulder and indicated for him to look outside the warehouse. In reality, most of the soldiers on the field had already cast their gazes outside. The sun above the mountains was gradually moving westward, and dusk was gradually thickening. In the light red background on a protruding hill, two figures stood facing each other. It was like a scene out of a paper cut. Du Xiaoqing and Su Lu. Although I know it's easy, I really only watched it for one night. How can I not be narcissistic? Wahahaha. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.